All right, everyone. Welcome to California Redistricting 2021. I am your webinar host for the day. This program is being presented by the Jack Citrin Center for Public Opinion Research and the California Constitution Center at Berkeley Law. My name is David Carrillo. I'm the Executive Director of the California Constitution Center, and I will be your stage director for today. I'd like to thank Jack Citrin for co-hosting this event with me and all the fine folks who put a lot of work into assembling the fine cast of characters who are going to be presenting today. I'm going to spend about 30 seconds talking about redistricting in general, and then I'm going to turn it over to Joe, the moderator of our first panel, to introduce our first speaker. So redistricting, our topic for the day. It used to be a decennial food fight, and several times the Supreme Court of California had to sort it all out, which I have a feeling they really didn't enjoy doing. Redistricting was also one of the top three structural problems in California government. The other two were the on-time budget requirement and term limits. The electorate has since addressed all three of those through the initiative process. Regarding redistricting specifically, it started in November 2008 when California voters passed Proposition 11, which created the Independent Citizens Redistricting Commission to draw new district lines and taking the job out of the hands of the California legislature, transferring it to the citizens where it probably belongs. The Redistricting Commission was amended by Proposition 20 in 2010, with adding responsibility for drawing congressional districts. And the commission has survived several attempted repeals. It was upheld by the California Supreme Court. It survived a Proposition 27 initiative attempt to repeal it in 2010, a federal court challenge, and Prop 40, which was a referendum in 2012. So I think the commission is here to stay. Its first district maps took effect in the June 2012 primary. And the fact that the legislature, the California Supreme Court, and the voters have all put substantial effort into this seemingly mundane task shows that it is key to the political process. Now, rather than representatives choosing their voters, California voters draw their own maps and they choose the representatives. The commission is now working with the 2020 census data, which just got released, to draw the maps for the next decade's political contests. And that is our topic for the day. Now, with that, I'm going to turn it over to Joe Garofoli to introduce our first speaker, who's going to talk about for about 15 or 20 minutes. And then after that, we'll get going with our first panel of the day. Joe, take it away.
All right. Thank you, David. Thank you to Jack. And thank you to all of you for being here today. I got a couple seconds here. Redistricting, as we all know, is one of the most important and often the wonkiest subjects we talk about in politics. And being real here, it's one that I and many in the news business struggle to explain to people how important it is to their lives. And so I hope that today we can talk about redistricting and all the things that are going on with it in a way that, of course, is in-depth and smart. And with this panel, I have no doubts about that, but also in a way that helps Californians understand what is at stake here and why it is so important to their lives in so many ways. Before I introduce the panelists, I wanted to set expectations here for the audience. We're going to hear from our first speaker, Eric Mcgee, for about 15-20 minutes. Then we'll hear from each of the other four speakers for about 10 minutes apiece. And I'll let the panelists know when if they start to run long. And then we'll have, I'll ask a few questions of the panelists for about 15 minutes or so, and then it is your turn. So sharpen your digital pencils and be ready to come up with some smarter questions that I'll have for the panelists. And in order of speaking today, we will have the first speaker will be Eric Mcgee. He's a senior fellow at the Public Policy Institute of California. Then following Eric will be Karen McDonald. She is the director of the statewide database. Then Alejandro Ponce de Leon, a senior policy and research analyst at the Advancement Project and convener of the Integrated Voter Engagement and Redistricting Alliance. Then we'll have Mindy Romero, who's the founder and director of the Center for Inclusive Democracy and a member of the Data Advisory Committee Redistricting Data Hub. And finally, we'll have Sarah Sidwani, who's an assistant professor of politics at Pomona College and a commissioner on the California Citizens Redistricting Commission. And with that, let's start with Eric. Take it away.
Thank you for having me, and thanks for this great panel. I'm really a privilege to be here. Let me work on my Zoom skills here and get this going. So today I'm going to present some maps that I presented to the commission a couple weeks ago, and they basically lay out the population change on a number of different dimensions of the state from the 2010 census enumeration to the most recent data that we have, which is for this kind of exercise, which is 2019. So I just want to note that the census numbers that were released recently were reapportionment numbers for the state as a whole. So we don't actually have the enumeration count yet for California. So what are we mapping in this? Oh, and I want to note also that my colleague Jennifer Pollack, who was instrumental in putting all this stuff together. What are we mapping here? So we're going to look at the total population. So that means we're going to include children and non-citizens in the numbers that we're presenting. I'm going to look at the Latino share of that total population and the Asian share of that total population and the Black or African American share of that total population. So those are the four sort of dimensions of change since 2010 that I'm going to show you. Where do we get these numbers? Well, so from 2010, we use the decennial census. That's just the actual count of every individual, the one that just happened last year, except in 2010. And then 2019, the American Community Survey. The American Community Survey is a massive survey that the US Census does over the course of every year to try and track population change in between censuses. Now, it is a survey, so that means that as your geography gets smaller, your sample size also gets smaller. And everybody who has followed public opinion polls in the media knows that they typically come with a margin of error. And so there's a margin of error to the American Community Survey. It's a large survey, so that margin is often small, but it is there nonetheless, and these are estimates. So what we tried to do was offer the best balance of the latest data, since one of the things that the commission wanted to use this for was doing outreach. So we wanted to be able to provide, a fair amount of nuance at the geographically speaking, but also have the latest data possible. So you can get your American Community Survey estimates all the way down to what they call block groups, which are very, very small levels of geography. But you have to average 5 years of the ACS to get it. Conversely, you can use just a 1 year average, so get kind of a more recent, more up-to-date data. But the smallest geographic unit you can get is what's called a Puma. All right, so what is a Puma? Yes, a Puma is a large cat, but in this case, it is a public use microdata area. These are census units that have at least 100,000 people in them. So they're not based on, they don't have to be a particular geographic size. They have to have a certain population to them. We have 265 Pumas in California with a median population of about 140,000 people. Now, Pumas are bad for drawing lines. This is not, the ACS is not the source, the data source that for the most part that the commission will be using to draw the new districts. And there's a variety of reasons for that. These are estimates. They can't go down to a small enough geographic area to really get the nuance in redistricting that you need. But regardless, they don't draw the lines with these numbers. What we're using these numbers for here is just kind of mapping out broad demographic patterns. So how things have changed since 2010, and what the general patterns are that we see at a level of nuance that allows us to say more than it allows us to break up, for instance, Los Angeles County into some pieces, which is useful because LA County is so big. And then finally, when we're talking about race or ethnicity, how do we define that here? Well, in this case, anyone who says that they're Hispanic in the ACS is considered Latino. Anyone who says that they are Black or African American or Asian, either by itself or they say that they are one of those groups in combination with another group. So the census allows you to say that you're multiracial or multi-ethnic. So anybody who at least says that they're Black or African American by itself or possibly in combination. Same thing with Asian. Those are going to be counted in those groups for the purpose of these maps. So there's some overlap between those categories. I just want to make that clear. All right, so the first thing is the change from 2010 to 2019 in total population. So the yellow to red, yellow, orange, red colors are all population loss, and the bluish colors are all population gains. The areas of highest population gain are in the Inland Empire, which is kind of the area to the east of Los Angeles, the Bay Area, Sacramento, and to a certain extent, San Diego. So those are the highest areas of growth. A lot of rural areas have actually lost population, and then you'll note this one area here. This is that really red area with the high population loss. That's where the campfire was in 2018. But you can see the area right next to it is really intense blue area, which suggests that a lot of the people who were displaced by the fire relocated pretty close by. This next map shows the same numbers from the first map, except as a deviation from the actual population change in California. So California has grown about 6% since 2010. And so these numbers are deviation off that 6%. So the biggest difference here is areas compared to the previous map is areas that have grown, but not grown as fast as 6%, according to the ACS, are shown here as yellow or yellowish or orange. The most notable area like that is Los Angeles County, which in the first map is mostly blue because it has grown a little bit overall over the past decade, but it's yellowish here because it hasn't grown as fast as the rest of the state. And when redistricting occurs, the district lines get adjusted to make the districts all equal in population. So these kinds of relative population shifts will likely be reflected in where the district lines end up. So the next few maps, I just want to show you where in 2019, each of the racial ethnic groups that we look at can be found in California. So this is not change here, this is just actually in 2019. And for Latinos, they are mostly concentrated in the Central Valley and along the mid coast. Of course, Central LA in general, and then the Inland Empire, sort of Western Riverside County, and then Imperial County. That's where the Latino population is highest, though as you can see, a lot of the state is sort of a darker shade of purple. So you can find reasonably substantial Latino populations in many parts of the state. This is the Asian population in 2019. You can see there's a lot more of the state where there isn't a very high Asian population. So they're much more concentrated geographically, mostly concentrated in the Bay Area and up into Sacramento, in parts of LA County and Orange County and San Diego. That's really where you'll find most of the Asian population. The Black or African American population is even more geographically concentrated, mostly found in the East Bay of the Bay Area, in Sacramento, and then in Central LA. Those are the main places where you find an African American population. Now, the change in the Latino population. This is now shifting from where they were in 2019 to how they changed between 2010 and 2019. And what really jumps out here is a couple things. First, that in the Inland Empire area, the Latino share of the population has increased quite a bit. But then also up in the Bay Area, it has actually declined. Now, the important thing to remember here is that these are population shares. So it is possible for the overall population of a group to increase, and while they are still a declining share of the population, which just means that other groups grew even more. And the Bay Area, as we'll see in just a second, that's what's going on there. It's not actually a population decline of Latinos. Other parts of the state have seen generally an increase in population, but those are the two sort of notable deviations from that. For Asians, the most of the population share growth has been in the Bay Area. So there's been a big increase in the share of Latinos in the Bay Area and of Asians in the Bay Area. Also in Orange County. Elsewhere, it's kind of a modest growth in most places. A few rural places with declines in the share. And finally, Black or African American, you can see kind of a mixed bag all over the state. Some areas where there's been a little bit of growth, some areas a little bit of decline, but not a lot of extremes either way. And actually, the Black population in California has been sort of, as a share of the total, has been pretty constant since 2010. So the last few maps I want to show you are just some zoom ins on some of the population centers, so you can get a little bit more of a flavor of some of these dynamics. In LA, this is now the total population in LA, the change, and you can see that it's a mixed bag, right? Some areas have seen population declines, and others some increases. Some areas just to the south of the central city where there's been even larger growth, but kind of a mixed bag. In LA, again, has grown a little bit since 2010, but not a lot. Here's the same thing for Latino population share. Again, kind of a mixed bag. The overall Latino population share has been relatively stable. The areas of growth have been kind of south of the central city and then up in the far north of the county. For the Asian population share, most areas of LA County have seen some growth. But overall, it's increased to a little over 1%, according to these ACS estimates. And then finally, the Black or African American population share, kind of a mixed bag, like we had seen in the statewide maps, with sort of a notable area of decline around LAX. Now, this is sort of Inland Empire, Orange County, San Diego. This is now, again, moving back to the total population change. And you can really see these areas of growth here in the Inland Empire, but also a few pockets in Orange County and in San Diego. For Latinos, there's a big increase in this Inland Empire area. So a large increase in the Latino population share, with many Pumas in here having majority of Latino populations now. And then not as much growth in other parts of this area of the state. And then for Asians, you can see more of growth in Orange County and maybe a little pocket of it in San Diego, but not as much in the rest of this area. And for African Americans, kind of again, where there's a sort of consistent story of some areas growing, some areas shrinking, but the overall population share staying relatively constant. And then finally, the Bay Area. The total population here you can see has increased quite a bit. This is one of the growth areas of the state, and all the way up into, you can see a little bit of Sacramento up here, some growth up there. But and in the Bay Area, it's specifically the Far East Bay and the exurbs of San Jose, where you see the most growth, and then also the Mission District of San Francisco. This is that interesting thing that I noted earlier, that the Latino population share has actually declined in the Bay Area, according to these estimates. But again, that's not because the Latino population in the Bay Area has actually shrunk. It has actually grown 8% between 2010 and 2019. But other populations have grown even more over the same period of time. And in particular, the Asian population in the Bay Area has grown quite a bit, especially out in sort of the Dublin, Pleasanton area, sort of that far eastern region. So you've seen a lot of Asian population share growth. So they've grown, the total population has grown 28% over this period of time, and 5% in terms of population share overall. And then the same, again, story for African Americans, sort of a mixed bag of some places growing, some places shrinking. So a few kind of thoughts on these maps before I wrap up. First of all, I just want to emphasize again that these are estimates. So what matters for actual redistricting is going to be the actual enumeration that we're going to get sometime in August, it looks like. The other thing to note about these maps is that the growing Latino and Asian populations and the sort of status quo African American population, that implies that non-Hispanic whites are declining as a share of the population. That's a longer term trend in California, but it is reflected in these numbers by their absence from these maps. I also would be remiss if I didn't mention a couple of more recent developments that have been happening and give some thoughts on them. The first is this morning, it was announced that we had the first ever recorded population decline for California, actual decline, not just sort of a relative slowdown. And that's really surprising and interesting. Where does it come from? Well, it comes from some longer term trends. We've had a slowing, there's the demographers break things into migration patterns and natural increase, which is births minus deaths. That natural increase has been slowing for a long time. We also have had a slowing rate of immigration over time. Those are kind of, again, longer term trends that have been happening. But there's also been some short term trends. There's been a recent increase in domestic outmigration where people have been moving out of the state. That does fluctuate around quite a bit. We have, in the typical year in the last 30 years, we've had net outmigration domestically, so people moving out of the state. That tends to be sort of backfilled by immigration from other countries. But that has that domestic outmigration has actually accelerated in recent years, and it apparently has also accelerated very recently. We also have seen, largely as a result of the pandemic, I think, a sharp decline in the birth rate, and of course, a sharp increase in deaths. So not clear how many of these trends will continue, but the actual population loss is clearly a cause of kind of longer term concern. The births deaths result is not totally unique to California because of the pandemic, but because of these broader trends, it's had a bit of an extra consequence for California. And then the other point is the reapportionment. We now know that we've lost a seat. I will note that lost a congressional seat, so we used to have 53, we will have 52 next time. I want that seat. People often ask where it comes from. That seat is lost for the entire state. It's not lost for one particular place, but some parts of the state might feel that loss more than others based on sort of how their relative population growth shakes out. Will that seat be a Democratic seat? Probably, but that'll depend a lot on how the seats are drawn and how politics develops. So probably is the best that you could say, right? It's not 100% by any means. Ironically, these numbers were not probably too much affected by the pandemic, because the day that the census is supposed to be counting for, like when you say like, okay, where when they're counting like how many people are in a particular household, they want to know how many were in that household on April 1st. So that's Census Day, April 1st, and a lot of the pandemic happened after April 1st. Also, I'll note we actually beat the Census Bureau's estimates for where they thought we were going to be. We just barely beat them, so we actually did, reasonably well. It would have been worse if Census Day was later in the year, probably. Also, I think the top line count that we got, we don't know yet whether it was a good count, whether the pandemic affected that count. But it does kind of pass the smell test. It lands a little bit above the Census Bureau's estimate and a little bit below the Department of Finance estimate. The estimates were not as great for every state. New York and New Jersey were particularly far off. They had much higher counts than were expected, but for California, ours was pretty in line. That doesn't mean the actual count is a good count, because there could be a lot going on under the surface, but it does mean that probably so far what we have suggests maybe things are okay. So that's, with that, I think that's all I have to say, and I'll pass it off to back to Joe.
Joe, you're up. Thank you, Eric.
Oh, okay. And I'm now it's Karin's turn.
Thank you so much. Let me try to share my screen. Just one moment, please. Can everyone see my screen?
I can see it.
Great, thank you very much for letting me know. Hello, everybody. This is Karen McDonald, Director of the Statewide Database. The Statewide Database is the redistricting database for the state of California, and I will talk a little bit about census, general timelines, and then how inmates are factoring into the statewide database this time. This is a pretty a long presentation, actually, given that I only have 10 minutes, so I will go through this very quickly. And you can always refer back to the slides, of course, and I'm available for questions. So I thought I'll start by talking about which data are needed for redistricting in general, and then where you can find them. So we know, of course, which data we need by looking at the criteria that are necessary to draw the districts. First and foremost, there is always equal population. Equal population is measured by using decennial census data. And that particular file is the PL 94-171 data file. That is the file that will be released later this year. The second criterion is compliance with the Federal Voting Rights Act. For that, we again use the PL 94-171 data. And then statement of registration, statement of vote, to look at, to be able to do a racially polarized voting analyses and so forth, and look at participation. There's also citizen voting age population, and that is the one variable that comes from the American Community Survey that Eric has been working with and has talked about. A very commonly seen criterion, and definitely one we have in California, is contiguity. For that, we use census geography. So basically, the district should be in one piece. Preserve counties, political subdivisions. For that, you also use a census geography. Respect for neighborhoods and communities of interest. For that, you have to collect your own data for the most part. So that is pretty much public testimony, and then data and geography submitted by the public. There is compactness, which is measured by using census geography, and then there's nesting. And nesting, of course, is done by using the newly created districts one way or the other. So these are pretty much the criteria that are in use in California. On the local level, there may be a few others that are being used, but this is essentially what you'll find on in every jurisdiction in California that has to redistrict. So very quickly, a note about census geographies that come with these particular data sets. So the data sets that I mentioned, they're all released on different geographies. There's census blocks, which is the smallest unit of geography, smallest unit of analysis that is being used. Then there's census block groups and tracts, and that is the data set that Eric was using. Basically is generated or released on block groups and tracts. Then there's election precincts, and then there is individual level data, and that is the statement of registration, voter registration. Census geography is maintained by the Census Bureau, and it stays constant for 10 years, but then precinct geography is maintained by local election officials. And just to think about geographies that come from local elections officials, those are basically drawn to comply with, the elections code, and they're organizing units to conduct elections to make sure that everybody gets the proper ballot. In some states, like California, these precinct geographies change very frequently. In other states, they don't change at all between censuses. So what's a redistricting database? What a redistricting database does is it essentially solves the problem of all these conflicting and frequently changing geographies. Contains various data sets, as I outlined in the previous slides, and it merges them and then releases them on the census block level. The census block level is where we create districts. We build districts from the census block level, and that is how we get equal populations, very equal populations, keep our deviations small and are able to do justice by communities and neighborhoods and so forth. Typically in a redistricting data set, in every redistricting data set, really, you will find the census data again, and that is, of course, what we're all waiting for right now. That's the PL 94171 data set. Again, that's released on the census block level. Then one adds citizen voting age population, the statement of vote data, and statement of registration data. And then communities of interest and neighborhoods and so forth are typically in a separate data set. So while they are very prominent in California, for example, they are not as prominent and not as important in other states throughout the US. So let's talk about inmate data reallocation. So to give you a little bit of legislative history, in 2011, there was a bill passed. It was Assembly Bill 420. That was the original bill that talked about inmate data reallocation. Essentially, the idea here is to do away with what's commonly known as prison gerrymandering, which essentially gives some districts a lot of people that, or it artificially inflates some districts. So essentially what this particular bill is trying to do is it tries to get rid of that particular problem of artificially inflating a particular jurisdiction and then putting those people back into their original neighborhoods and communities. So AB 420 started that process. In 2012, there was another bill that tried to clarify some sections of that bill. It was AB 1986. And then in 2018, there was a technical cleanup bill, AB 2172, which was authored by our current Secretary of State in California, and it updated the bill and made some modifications just to make sure that this bill could actually be implemented as intended. So a little bit of background. Again, I know I'm going through a lot of election code sections. Election code section 21003 reads that after April 1 and no later than July, in the year ending with 0, the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation is to provide a single database with information about every incarcerated person in a facility under their control to the commission, the State Redistricting Commission, and the legislature. So that, just to clarify why State by Database ended up with this particular data set, under subdivision B of section 8253 of the Government Code, it's the legislature's responsibility to provide a complete and accurate computerized database for redistricting, and that responsibility is fulfilled by us. The State by Database, we're located on the UC Berkeley campus. Of course, we're part of the law school and used to be part of the Institute, the IGS. And in 2010, the 2010 Commission voted in 2019 to make the State by Database the recipient of that file transmitted by the Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation. And that was mostly done because they did not have the capacity to accept a data file that came with considerable security restrictions and confidentiality restrictions. And the legislature also designated the State by Database as the recipient of that file. And of course, since we are the people that are building the redistricting database, that makes a lot of sense. So the transmitted data came to us. They had a unique identifier, a residential address or multiple addresses at which the person was domiciled before incarceration. And then it also included the person's ethnicity and race and the location of the facility of incarceration. We received 122,730 unique IDs. And we started to geocode them, and the first geocode basically resulted in about a 50% match, and we are now data cleaning and have been data cleaning for some time. The legislature, in coordination with the CRC, shall ensure that the CDCR data set is incorporated into the statewide database, is what this election code section says. And then also it gives clarity about what we're supposed to do. What we will do is we will adjust the total population, race, and ethnicity based on the data set that we received by removing data from the location where people were enumerated, and then reallocating them to geographies of their last residence, if possible. Not everybody has an address that can be geocoded, as you probably gathered. So there was some clarity in this particular election code section also about what to do if that is the case. And if a specific previous residential address is not available, then the smallest geographic unit possible will be used for geographic reallocation. The legislature requested, and the CRC, and this is the new CRC, the new commission, agreed to deem each incarcerated person as residing at their last residential address rather than the place of incarceration. In terms of inmates that are currently or were enumerated in federal prisons, this presents everybody with an additional challenge, and that challenge is that it's very difficult to get any data from the Federal Bureau of Prisons. In Election Code Section 21003D1 of the Elections Code, the legislature requests the commission to deem each inmate in a federal facility to reside at an unknown geographical location in the state, and then exclude them from the population count for any district, ward, or precinct. So this is obviously a little different because we're unable to reallocate people because we don't have previous addresses. And in any case, based on that information, based on information that the statewide database received, just to give you some numbers, there were 14,494 inmates that were incarcerated in 13 federal correctional facilities throughout California, and the CRC has not yet voted on whether to implement this section. Finally, census delays and new timelines. So the old timeline was that we were supposed to get the PL94 redistricting data file in by April 1. That's generally it's by April 1 in the year ending with 1. So it's 1 year after the data are collected. And then 30 days after receipt of the PL94, usually the statewide database releases the official redistricting database for the state of California. And of course, what we do during that time is, we create this block level data set that I outlined earlier. The new timeline, which of course was caused by COVID delays and then also some political issues that were going on, are now by August 16, the census will release the PL94 block level data, and they're releasing it in a different format than anticipated. It's called the legacy format, and because of that, the census is calling this data set the legacy data, but it is the PL94 redistricting data set. So that's going to be out by August 16. By August 23, so roughly a week later, the statewide database will release a user-friendly version of that PL94 171, so basically the anticipated version. And then by September 23, 30 days later, the California statewide database will release the official 2021 redistricting database, and that data set will reflect the adjusted inmate populations. And that is it for me. Thank you very much, and I am going to be here for questions.
Okay. Okay, and next we have Alejandra. Alejandra, are you here?
Yes, I'm here. Thank you. Thank you so much. So I don't have a PowerPoint presentation, but there were several questions that were provided that, that they would like to hear about from us for this event. And so I wanted to share a little bit about just like background on, who Advancement Project is, why is it that we convened at one point the Redistricting Collaborative and the Integrated Voter Engagement Redistricting Alliance. Also to talk a little bit about just like, what we believe how could communities of interest be impacted by a compacted calendar for redistricting, and being able to share a little bit about, why is it that our group has advocated, for a final map deadline and primary date. And so I will be talking about that in my section. And so first off, Alejandra Ponce de Leon with Advancement Project California. Advancement Project, it's a civil rights organization, statewide civil rights organization. And our work is very much explicit about how do we advance racial and economic equity here in California when it comes to our public education, public funds, and for myself in particular, being part of the Political Voice project or team, our democracy. And so our Political Voice team, that's where we house a lot of the work for democracy reform work that our organization has. And so within the Political Voice team, we have a theory of change. Despite being a majority minority state since 2000, our democracy does not reflect its demographic reality. There are significant racial and economic disparities that persist in voting and other forms of political participation, with whites participating at higher rates than people of color, and individuals with higher levels of income and education participating at higher rates than their lower income and less educated counterparts. So similarly, racial and economic gaps persist in government responsiveness, with whites tending to be overrepresented and people of color tending to be underrepresented. And so for our Political Voice, we envision a California in which state and local governments are more participatory and responsive to the communities that they serve. And so within our team, our goals are that one, all community members are able to genuinely participate in the making of effective policy in ways that go beyond just voting. And two, that governments respond equitably to community concerns. And so within our Political Voice team, where we house a lot of our democracy work, we focus on census, we focus on redistricting, voting in elections, and also just being able to focus on, how do we create the institutional changes necessary to increase participation of low-income people of color in the state, whether it's at the local level or at the state level. And so for us, so with census, redistricting is foundational to our representative democracy, and it has a long-term impact on how responsive and representative elected officials will be, especially for communities that are underrepresented and marginalized, that tend to be low-income, Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities. And so it's foundational because it sets the stage for the next 10 years. And what is possible, right? What are their chances of really being, one, represented, one, being included in keeping their communities of interest together, and also being able to be represented and be actually having elected officials that are responsive to their needs. And so that's why it's really critical. That's why it was imperative, for Advancement Project, to engage in the redistricting process. And most importantly for us, given that our work, we're not a base building organization. We support base building organizations. We provide the technical assistance, the research, the data analysis to really support the work that groups are doing on the ground already, who are most engaging with communities that are most impacted by racial and economic disparities. And so for us, we felt that it was important that within this redistricting cycle and in the future redistricting cycles, that community-based organizations that are doing the heavy lift, to really shift power, to really increase the capacity of communities that are marginalized, for their civic engagement capacity to be able to address their most pressing needs, to actually see policy change that changes their quality of life, for them to be at the table, and to complement the work that so many organizations, legacy organizations, have done and continue to do within redistricting. And so how can we complement and how do we bring those voices for them to be a direct participants and engaging in this process? And so At first, we convened the Redistricting Collaborative along with Common Cause, California Common Cause during 2019. And so at that stage, and with the collaborative, our work was really focused on the application and selection process for the Citizens Redistricting Commission. Our goal for all of us together was really like, how do we ensure that more residents that are not engaging in redistricting, are actually not even aware about this redistricting process, actually be engaged and outreached and informed about, you know, here's this opportunity where you could actually be on this commission, right? And for you to learn about what it, you know, what it takes, and, you know, and help to support them in the whole application process, right? And so we work together to inform as many residents across California through our networks, and we were able to, you know, substantially increase, you know, a lot of folks to apply that would have probably, if it wasn't for all of our partners' efforts, would have not even known about this opportunity. And so that was the work that we were doing then. We then stepped down as a convener, and we continue to stay involved with the Redistricting Collaborative. And now we convene the Integrated Voter Engagement Redistricting Alliance, and what we call it as the IVE Redistricting Alliance. And so the Alliance, it was formed to empower low-income Black, Indigenous, and people of color residents to participate in the 2021 state and local redistricting processes. And it was really about, you know, how do we strengthen the organizational ecosystem needed to sustain long-term equity-centered change? And that's like key for our alliance. It's really about how do we advance a racial equity and economic equity lens through this whole redistricting process. And so our partners include statewide and regional networks of community-based organizations that implement integrated voter engagement strategies, and they prioritize issues of racial and economic equity. And so for folks that are not familiar with integrated voter engagement, this is it's an approach, it's a program where community groups that are organizing, you know, constantly organizing, you know, the residents, their base, either on issues on education, health, whatever the focus of their organization is. They've also embedded a program where it's about how do we engage, you know, these communities that are most impacted by the decisions that happen, the policies that get implemented. How are they involved and are mobilized to actually become engaged in elections, right? So a lot of our partners are actually very much focused on, you know, mobilizing, informing, and engaging, you know, low propensity voters, youth of color. You know, who are those community members that, you know, typically when it comes to elections, they tend to be overlooked sometimes by candidates and parties, you know, to mobilize voters, you know. And so these community groups have had an intentional program to really uplift and strengthen civic engagement of these communities so that they're able to be engaged in that field, but not just during elections, come and knock on their doors and get you out to vote, but rather how are you involved in the work that they're doing throughout the year. So that's why it's called an integrated voter engagement project. And so these partners, you know, our alliance together, we're really focused on two areas of work. So one is community empowerment. You know, how do we engage and educate community residents about the state, and now also like local redistricting processes, and you know, how do we supply the technical assistance for residents, you know, in drawing communities of interest maps and to submit these maps and to submit public testimony to the state and all local jurisdictions. So that's one area. The other area is movement building. You know, how do we build up our members' capacity? So our partners, you know, a lot of them, for the majority, it's their first time ever doing redistricting. And so how are we collectively learning with each other, learning together, and building up our capacity to integrate redistricting into their ongoing organizing programs and strategies for systems change? You know, how do we create an impact that's lasting and that it's long-term, that really addresses the issues that are most impacting the communities that all of our partners are working with directly with residents? And ultimately, the vision for our alliance is how do we, you know, create a more equitable California? So that's the essence that's driving us, and that's why we've gotten engaged. And so in terms of, and as Karen has shared, there's been, shifts in the calendar, for redistricting and, for our alliance, we're very concerned in terms of like, how will that impact, residents, right? And I know that, for Commissioner Sadwani and the rest of the commissioners, they're in a very, difficult situation, of trying to figure out, how do we continue to center community? How do we create a redistricting process that is inviting and inclusive of so many folks? And how do we deal with like these changing timelines? And so for us, as an alliance, we've been advocating strongly that, that it is about centering residents. It's centering those communities that typically are not involved, in these kinds of processes, that are alienated from these processes many times. And so for us, we have concerns about, ultimately, which is the deadline that's going to be selected, right? And for us, it's more about like, what do communities need to be fully engaged, right? Residents, everybody, they need time to learn. One, we need to be able to have residents and community partners to be able to understand and analyze redistricting data, once it becomes available. We also need to have time to draw initial maps, our community of interest maps. Given that there's multiple organizations and partners working together, and there's multiple spaces, collaborative spaces on redistricting, there needs to be time to be able to communicate with each other and work through potential conflicts, points of conflict. We need to have time to prepare for testimony and advocacy on behalf of maps, understand and analyze the commission's draft maps, right? Be able to provide feedback, to draft maps, and being able to comment on the final deliberations, towards the end of the redistricting process. So there are multiple steps, and the more time that we can get to be able to prepare to fully engage, not just our partners and their base, but everybody, right? That's what's critical, from our lens. And so, and I think what's also we need to be mindful is that, for community residents, especially the ones that we've been, really focused on, they often face barriers to public participation, right? And when you have a condensed timeline, to be able to engage in a process that is so abstract, so complex, right? Like there are, the barriers may intensify, right? So one of the concerns is that, what if, the deadline, for maps falls like during the holiday season, how could we overcome the challenge of mobilizing residents to engage? So when commission, are holding their meetings that they conflict with holiday travel or even quality time now with, more folks getting vaccinated and being able to be with their families, that's going to be something that's something that's real, right? Our everyday lives, that's something that's valuable and important. And, during the holidays, there might be constraints, right? Of like, the community organizations, businesses, public institutions that a lot of residents rely on to get understanding, to get information, what if they're, they're shutting down for the holidays? And so there's a myriad of like, of barriers, that we need to be mindful of. And so for us, we have come together and have been very thoughtful and intentional about, how do we move forward, and how can we be also a thought partner to the commissioners to support a lot of the work, to bring the voices of a lot of the residents that, still find redistricting so challenging and so hard to navigate and understand. And then we thought about, like, how do we ensure as much time as possible, for this process, so communities can be fully engaged, meaningfully engaged in the process. And just recently, in this last month, we sent a letter, to the commission, uplifting, our recommendation of, considering the January 28th deadline. As a possibility, right, for them to set the deadline for the redistricting process. And again, as I've been sharing, the community needs enough time to fully engage. Again, the redistricting process, it's complex. Talking about communities of interest, what is that? That's still a term that, a lot of folks are not familiar with, and they're still, wrapping their minds around. And even for the community organizations that are now engaging in this is also a new process. And like, how do you teach yourself, build up your capacity so then you're able to engage residents as well? This process includes data, maps, there's multiple stages, the hearings, how do you advocate, how do you advocate effectively? And on top of that, it's not just the statewide redistricting process that's happening, but there's also redistricting happening at multiple levels. So at the city, at the county, school board levels, all of these are happening all at the same time. And so for a lot of our partners that are centered and working in specific regions and really, working to build up the capacity of their base of residents there to engage, how do you now engage them on multiple fronts, right? And how do you build up their capacity? And so those are some of the things that, that we're grappling with and that really informed our thinking about how can we have as much time as possible. Again, redistricting is not the sexiest thing. I think it's sexy because as we get into it, it's like, oh my gosh, how can you not think this is sexy? But this is something that is not, it's very abstract. It's very invisible actually for the majority. And only those that are like very much in tune and are knowledgeable, like understand this, but for others, like this is like, what, redistricting, what is this? So again, I've mentioned that many of our partners, it's their first time doing redistricting. So there is a big learning curve for all of us in building our capacity. And again, there's so much time needed, also for coordination and to be able to collaborate across various spaces, right? And all of these spaces, like really being mindful about how do we build up the capacity of residents to engage? How do we help to remove barriers? How do we make the process easier, accessible? How is it inclusive of so many different communities, whether, you come from rural or urban areas and so forth. And so these are the kinds of things that we are being mindful of. And kind of like the reason why we have proposed this stepwise.
Thank you so much, Alejandra. And believe me, I too think redistricting is sexy. So and the people tuning in here do too. So, okay, let's, Mindy Romero, you're up next. Thank you so much. Mindy, are you there?
Yes, I am.
Oh, hey, how you doing?
Hi. Hello, everyone. Thank you. So I'm going to go ahead and also share my screen. I've been asked today to talk about specifically the National Redistricting Data Hub. So one moment. Should be able to see my PowerPoint, I hope.
I see it.
Thank you. Okay, great. So I want to make a distinction here. we're talking about California Redistricting 2021. We have, of course, a statewide database housed at UC Berkeley, led by Karen McDonald, very esteemed colleague here on the panel. What I'm going to be talking about is a national resource that has California data, but has data also for all 50 states. I've been asked by the organizers to talk about this a little bit and let people know what kinds of resources are available for, really across the country. There is California data in the Redistricting Data Hub, but of course, again, we have our own California-based database that we've had for decades now, and I would certainly expect and hope that many people will use that as a reference, right, and as a resource. All right, jumping in. All right, so what is the Redistricting Data Hub? It is as they state on their website and in their materials, a nonpartisan organization whose mission is to provide individuals, civic organizations, good government groups, the data, tools, and knowledge to participate effectively in redistricting processes, right? Their stated goal really is to democratize the data, to make it available to any group. Let me move these pictures here down so I can see better. To any group or group who wants to define their communities, provide meaningful public input, recognize gerrymandering, and advocate for fair and legal maps. So a lot of what we were just talking or hearing from Alejandra about, right, the very important voice that we need to have in this redistricting process, right, from the community. This is about democratizing data and making sure that those data are available to community members that typically, historically haven't had access, right, to data like this. So we've already had everyone discuss just how deeply, intensely, or how, very data intensive the process is. That's an understatement, my bullet point. Legislatures across the country have traditionally been responsible, of course, for redistricting. In California, though, we do have, as already noted, a California Redistricting Commission, Citizens Redistricting Commission, which really has been a model for other states. As a whole, though, across the nation, it's at the legislative level. And legislatures have had sole access to the data, to tools, really to the knowledge necessary, right, to go through this redistricting process, to draw the maps, right, for legal compliance. Good government and voting rights groups have had to spend a lot of time and resources collecting data on their own and cleaning data. And of course, there's a wide variation in just the resources, right, and expertise, right, the groups have, understandably so, in being able to go through this process. Variation across states, within states. If we're talking about the most inclusive process possible by the most groups and voices represented, even within the same state, right, not all groups, right, have the same ability to engage with the data and then ultimately engage in the redistricting process with their legislatures. And in California, of course, wanting to see, as Alejandra mentioned, right, groups being able to engage actively with the Citizens Redistricting Commission in that process. So RDH came about because several groups came together, really to identify that this is a problem, and the ultimate solution, or at least one solution, is to have a central repository for high quality data. So RDH provides the data for free. If that's not clear, you have to meet their terms of service, and essentially that is that you agree that you're not going to use it for gerrymandering with a giant exclamation point. Of course, people ultimately can download it as a public resource and do what they will with it, but they agree at least to not do so, not do gerrymandering. So RDH hosts the data and it's collected by their data partners. It's validated by the RDH team. If it gets up there early and it's not yet validated, it's noted that it's not yet validated, but it will go through that process at some point. And the data that's up there, right, on the database for all 50 states is something, very similar, right, of course, to what we've been talking about here today, includes all the data that we've been talking about here today. So data from the Census Bureau on population and CFAP estimates, boundary, including, of course, ACS data in that description, boundary files, population projections, voter file data, election results joined with precinct boundaries, all 50 states, and down many levels of geography, and of course, down to the census block level where possible. Let's move on here. There also are a lot of resources available to you from RDH beyond trainings, beyond the data itself, and that includes trainings on redistricting itself, on topics related to redistricting. They're free and open to the public. There's a help desk, right, to answer questions with regard to the data itself, but other questions that might be relevant, or refer people to other organizations, partner organizations. And RDH also has made a point from the beginning, as I understand it, to partner with a number of stakeholder groups. That group is ever growing, but to really inform and advise them in real time on their data needs, so that the hub is always attempting to address those needs. Okay, so I've also been asked to talk a little bit about undercount, census undercount. So in order to determine net undercounts, the Census Bureau uses two methods: demographic analysis, DA, and dual systems estimates, DSE. Now, I will say, full disclosure here, I'm not, a detailed methodologist here on these elements, but I just want to put them forth so that way you have this information. The DA itself compares, or the DA method, compares the census count to an independent estimate of the expected population based on births, deaths, and net international migration. DSE relies on a post-enumeration survey to gather information on people, or to compare it to that census count. And that's the post-enumeration survey is a sampling of the population, a survey that's independently conducted after the census for the purpose of looking at its accuracy, if you're not familiar with that. In 2010, the groups who are most likely to be net undercounted at the US level, and that's important to emphasize, right? Not California, but US level, were young children between the ages of 0 and 4, 4.6%. American Indians alone or in combination on reservations, that's a category. Black alone or in combination, Hispanics, renters, and men. And there's just a citation there that's from the US Census, a number of publications that they've cited that, as well as a book titled Differential Undercounts from Bill O'Hare. And then in terms of undercounts, what do you do about it? So the Census Bureau itself uses administrative data to impute missing values for undercounted populations, including USPS undeliverable as addressed, IRS forms, Census master address file, and ACS data, other sources, including, I should say sources, including Medicare, Indian Health Service records. And then lastly, just a slide here to give you some resources. I assume, or at least I'm happy to make my slides available if people are interested. There is a census report titled, and I'm not giving you, of course, all the resources or all the citations that may be relevant or be of interest to people, but just some notes here. A report titled Intended Administrative Data Use in the 2020 census, or in 2020. That outlines the plan for using administrative data from the census for post-response data processing. And I've got a little note there where to find it in particular. There are other data sources that are used for imputation, and that's also noted in the report. So it's just a good kind of resource there. And then the Center on Poverty and Inequality from Georgetown Law. They have a report entitled Who Responded in the 2020 Census, Variation in Track Level Response Rates. And that report analyzes self-response patterns in order to estimate undercount. So again, just some resources there. So I think I might have saved us a few minutes time. I'm gonna go ahead and exit. There we go. And I'll pass it back to Joe.
All right. Thank you so much. And our last speaker is Sarah, Professor. Are you there?
I'm here.
All right, wonderful.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me and really creating this space to talk about redistricting. It's very exciting. We've had a lot of really great data presentations. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about people. Because I think, as Alejandra noted, that it's the people ultimately that really have the influence in this process. And that's what makes this process here in California so completely different from redistricting of the past, as well as redistricting that's happening in most other states. And it's a big part of why we see the movement towards independent commissions picking up speed nationwide. Right. So I first wanted to just start off by talking a little bit about who we are on the commission. As you probably all are aware, we're a 14-member commission. There are 5 Democrats, 5 Republicans, and 4 members with no party preference or independence. We are certainly a very diverse group, diverse in terms of geography as well as opinions and expertise. There are 7 of us from Northern California and 7 of us from Southern California, 8 women, 6 men. We range in age from our 30s to our 60s. And among us, you'll find NGO leaders, engineers, pastors, law enforcement officers, a political scientist, a lawyer, as well as public servants. So we are really a very diverse group, and I do think very reflective of the diversity of the state of California itself. So I first off just want to invite folks to join us in our meetings. Because of the COVID pandemic, all of our meetings are held virtually. And so certainly you can find instructions and the link to tune in on our website at redrawthelineca.org. So I want to talk a little bit about how, the census delay, or I was asked to talk a little bit about the census delay. And also I want to think a little bit about how all of this scenario that we are living in is very different from 2010, right? So the census delay has, of course, created considerable barriers to our work. And that required us to think about our work in new and different ways. And I think amongst the commissioners, there's a lot of certainly support for independent redistricting commissions in general, and a lot of respect for the 2010 commission. And I think, not speaking for all of my other colleagues here, but I think across the board, amongst the commissioners, there's a real sense of wanting to build upon the amazing legacy that the 2010 commission set. That being said, however, we're also in very different circumstances. And so we've had to think kind of creatively about how to operate during these unprecedented times. I feel like unprecedented times is one of those sayings that we hear over and over again in this last year. We certainly heard about a lot of the lessons learned from 2010, and we've been trying our best to not fall down and make some of the same mistakes or blunders that 2010 had encountered throughout their process. And they were very gracious in leaving a lot of notes for us. Many of the 2010 commissioners have been engaged and calling in and giving us their support and advice, when possible. Some of those things, however, that have changed, do make a big difference in terms of how we approach our work, right? 10 years has passed. And during that time, of course, technologies have changed. And so our outreach also looks quite differently. And in just a moment, I'll talk a little bit more about what our outreach is looking like at this point in time. So ultimately, we're using a lot of new kinds of technologies and thinking about the process that the 2010 Commission underwent and how we can be prepared for it this time around. I think from many of the memos that we've read, as well as conversations with folks that were engaged in the 2010 process, it was a shock or it was an uncertainty at least, to not know how many people would actually be involved. And of course, the 2010 Commission received over 20,000 submissions from Californians who wanted to weigh in on the redistricting process. We anticipate that number will be even greater this time around as more people are learning about the redistricting process and wanting to get involved. And so we're trying to plan the infrastructure to manage all of those inputs. Of course, we are also operating during the COVID-19 pandemic, and with that creates a whole host of challenges. I've never met any of the other commissioners. I'm trying to think. No, I haven't met any of the other 14 commissioners in person. We've been serving on the commission since August of last year, so going on almost a year. We meet regularly in very long all-day meetings, sometimes many days per week, and yet we've never met in person. That, of course, creates strains just in our ability to work together and develop as a team. I think, though, that we've actually done a really great job. I'm often asked what it's like, working across the aisle with people of different political partisan backgrounds, and I'm happy to report that it brings me so much joy and so much hope that I really respect all of my colleagues, and given all of the vitriol in the political speech over the last several years, I certainly wasn't certain what to expect when joining the commission. And I'm very happy to report that it brings me a lot of hope for the future of our country when I see my own ability to work with my colleagues across the aisle. In addition to the pandemic, in addition to new technologies and all of these changes, we also have much more time. A part of that is actually in thanks to the 2010 Commission, who recognized that the commission needs more time to get set up, to get established. And so we were seated last summer, not knowing yet what the impact on the delay of the census would be. We anticipated that there would probably be a delay, but we didn't have any sense of just how long it would actually be. And because of the work of the 2010 census, they actually worked to build in additional months for the commission to be able to set up shop. We are building a full organization and government agency from the ground up. Most of us have very little background in how state agencies run, in the process of contracts and such things. So it's been a steep learning curve, and that extra time has been absolutely essential to our process. In terms of the census delay itself, it's definitely a considerable barrier to our work. We, of course, just received the reapportionment data at the federal level. We await the arrival of the redistricting data. But as we wait, what happens with that is we get extra time. And so we're really trying to take lemons and make lemonade and use that extra time for public education. One of the key lessons learned that we heard from the 2010 Commission was that with that extra time, we should engage in public education. And that's exactly what we've been doing. And I think also largely speaking to the points that Alejandra made, that there is an absolute need to go out and talk with Californians about what is redistricting and why does it matter. And in fact, making redistricting sexy has been a mantra of the 2020 Commission, and certainly very much a part of the work as we see it, is going out and doing educational sessions. And so even now, we've been in an educational period from February through this time in May. We have a redistricting basics presentation. We are available as possible to any groups that want it. Any group that would like to request a presentation can go onto our website and simply fill out a very simple request form, and a commissioner will be assigned to do that presentation. If it's absolutely impossible to get a commissioner there, we actually have a video recording with all of our faces giving that presentation as well. To that effect, in terms of that outreach, we're also translating all of our public education and outreach materials into numerous languages and working on policies to make sure that if folks call in and need to speak another language, that we can have an interpreter available as well. So we recognize, the great diversity that exists in California, and we're trying to develop the infrastructure to really engage with communities across the state. And to that end, this summer we'll be beginning next month. In fact, in June, we'll be beginning the process to go out into the community and hear that testimony from folks on the ground about where their communities of interest lie, right? This is one of the key qualitative pieces of data that we want to collect. And while a lot of political pundits want to tell you about where a seat is going to be lost in California, we aren't thinking about it from that perspective at all. We're thinking about what is the information that we're getting from communities on the ground, and how are we going to build districts so that people can have fair representation. To that end, as we begin this process, I think two pieces are really important to note. First, unlike 2010, we're going to be starting this process before we have census data. So for, back in 2010, because of their shortened timeline, they already had census data when they were going out and doing those communities of interest input sessions. We're actually going to be doing front loading all of that work and doing it throughout the summer. We have a very aggressive agenda actually set up to be doing input meetings across the state. At this point, they're still all going to be done virtually due to the pandemic and the uncertainties that continue to be there for us. But we're also looking at the possibility of pivoting to at least some portion of in-person in the future. And so this is a really exciting piece for us, because we anticipate that it'll help us buy a lot of time in the process by collecting all of that community input before we ever even receive census data. A second way in which we're collecting community input that I wanted to share with you is the communities of interest mapping tool that was developed by the statewide database, and they did an amazing job. I'm going to share my screen just very briefly so that folks can take a quick look at the map. Are you all seeing that screen?
I see it.
Perfect, great. So this is the website. It's drawmycacommunity.org. You can also access it from the Commission's website at wedrawthelinesca.org. You can get a tutorial on here. I'm going to skip that real quick and continue as a guest, or you can log in. And here it's a really user-friendly mapping tool so that folks can go in and zoom down to the localized level and really map out where it is that their community lies. I'm not going to do a full tutorial here. You can certainly go around and play around with it, but we are ramping up to receive this testimony from folks. They can absolutely put in all of the information about where their community lies and why they want to keep their communities together. I will stop that share just briefly there. A couple additional points, right? In terms of the census delay, we have been very fortunate that last year, the legislature and the Secretary of State, in coordination with many community groups, went to the California Supreme Court, acknowledging that the census data was likely to be delayed and to request additional time. And so as of right now, we do have an extended timeline going beyond our typical timeline of August 15th. The way that the ruling of the court was structured is that if that data was dropped by July 31st, we would have until December 15th and 1 additional day for each day of delay. So at present, we're anticipating the data to, hopefully to come sometime in early August. And so we're really in a waiting game to see exactly when we'll receive that data. Finally, of course, as a commissioner, but also as a political scientist and a scholar of race and ethnic politics, I would be remiss to not take the opportunity, particularly during Asian American and Pacific Islander Heritage Month, to note that this will be the first time in US history that a state that is a majority minority state is going to engage in redistricting. And I think this is really consequential. As Eric laid out in the beginning of this panel, we continue to see changes in the demographics of the state of California. And I think we'll have in front of us a whole host of questions to think about the multiracial ways and the multiracial demographics of this state and what that means in terms of compliance with the Voting Rights Act and what that means in terms of fair representation for communities on the ground. And I think that'll be a really exciting process for us to engage in, and most certainly to be thinking about, and hearing from communities themselves about where their interests lie. And then just finally, I'll say, to this piece around the loss of a seat here in California, most analysts were anticipating that California was due to lose that seat. I hear a lot of political pundits liking to opine about where that seat is going to come from. And so I just want to stress that from the perspective of the commission, as we will be the ones to actually redraw those districts, we don't have a sense of where it's going to come from. We don't have any magic eraser in which we're going to just go and erase one district and shift everything else around. For the congressional map, we will absolutely have to clear the map and start fresh using that testimony from communities on the ground, using the data sources that we have. And we have very specific criteria that we are required to use when drawing district boundaries. Certainly, the politics of the incumbents and where they live is not one of those criteria, just as the rate of population change is also not one of those criteria. Instead, to ensure equal population is one of those criteria. And so that's absolutely what we'll be using as we redraw California's lines. And with that, thank you so much for having me today.
Okay, thank you all. There was a lot of food for thought there. And I can guarantee one thing after listening to this presentation: we will be seeing the words "make redistricting sexy" again in the San Francisco Chronicle sometime in the near future. Eric, my political reporter ears pricked up when you said, in terms of losing a seat, I know the commissioner said that we don't know where it will be, but you said it will likely be a Democratic seat. Why do you say that, and where might it be?
It doesn't look like I can start my video. I don't know if, can you hear me?
I can hear you.
I can hear you.
Okay, I can't. Yeah, I can't. I don't know. Oh, there we go. Got it.
I just did it for you.
Great, thanks. Yeah, so I think the important thing you got to emphasize here is that the loss of the congressional seat is really a statewide phenomenon, right? So the state of California lost a seat, and we don't, in terms of, and then separate from that reapportionment process, you have to make sure that the new districts are equal in population and that they reflect the changes that have been happening over the course of the last decade. There's a little bit of wiggle room around that population equality in order to achieve other goals, but it's reasonably strict. And so to the extent that there's shifts around the state and where the population lies, you're going to have to reflect that in the new lines. So just in terms of trying to figure out where the seat will be lost, it's going to be lost for the whole state, but some areas where there's been more or less growth are going to sort of feel that loss, if you will, more than others. The other thing is, in terms of the politics of it, I know that's what everybody wants to know. The only reason to think that it's a Democratic seat per se is because California is a Democratic state and most of the seats that we have currently are Democratic, right? There's a range of possible plans that could be drawn with all kinds of different potential outcomes, and it's too soon to say that we'll know kind of what those political consequences will be down the road. I mean, another way of thinking about it is imagine, take a look at Texas, for instance. Texas has gained 2 seats in this most recent redistricting. It gained more than any other state. And you might be tempted to say, oh, that means that there's going to be 2 Republican seats that are added to the ledger. But, Texas has also been shifting Democratic. So, it depends so much on where the growth areas within the state are. And it depends on the kind of map that the Texas legislature ends up drawing.
So when we hear people, there's been a lot of chatter about it being, likely that it would be around the Los Angeles area. But does that make sense to you, or is that any more likely there than somewhere else?
Well, again, the shifts that we've seen in population around the state, you have to put them in perspective too. Like, we haven't seen dramatic population shifts. So the amount of change that we're talking about is really more sort of fractions of a seat for any particular area. But probably the better way to think about it is we're trying to redraw the lines and adjust things so that people and not places are represented. That's what a lot of what the redistricting process is about. It's about saying, okay, so in the last 10 years, the population has changed. We want our districts to represent people. We don't want them to represent places. So places that haven't grown as much or have actually lost population are, that we're going to have to adjust the lines so that the areas where there has been growth or we have seen more population, we want the districts to reflect that so that they're representing people and not places.
Something else you mentioned, this is for everybody to chime in on. You mentioned a good count, whether this is a good count. This is a basic question. Do you think that from the census figures we've seen so far, does it accurately represent the true population of California?
Yeah, that's also a tough question. There's been a lot of discussion about how to make that determination this time around. It's tough because even some of the benchmarks that we might have for knowing if the population, what the quote unquote true population is, which Mindy had mentioned in her presentation, even some of those benchmarks are potentially compromised by COVID, right? So COVID might have affected the count, and some of the benchmarks might have been affected, and so it's a little hard to know exactly what the true number is, right? And how far off we are from it. I will also note that the numbers we've got so far look, like I said, they passed the smell test in the sense that they are kind of within the boundaries of the estimates that were out there. That doesn't mean that they're right for all of the populations of California, because you can have some communities that are overcounted and some communities that are undercounted. And for the purposes of redistricting, it's that differential overreport and overcount and undercount that really matters for the sense of a fair and accurate census.
Mindy, what do you think? Good count?
Can you hear me? I'm trying to get my video back
Yeah,
on.
there you go.
I can hear you.
Okay, my video's not working, but that's okay. Hold on one second. I'm getting a little note here. Oh, well.
I just started your video.
There we go. Not that you really need to see me for me to answer. You know, I agree with Eric. I mean, the only thing I would add to it is just clearly there have been concerns for quite a long time around what the count would look like before COVID, because of some of the differences. One reason is because of some of the differences in the methodological approach of the census this time around. You know, concerns and some distrust around the Trump administration period, and then and then COVID, right? So I think not till we start to see some of the detailed data will we really start to get into the conversations around what the implications truly are from what we see. But I'm glad that Eric feels it passed the smell test, at least initially. So
that's good news for all Californians.
Yeah.
I have a question for our commissioner here, and anyone else who wants to weigh in as well. After the last redistricting, ProPublica wrote a story that said Democrats had essentially manipulated the process. This is a quote from the story. Quote, Democrats surreptitiously enlisted local voters, elected officials, labor unions, and community groups to testify in support of configurations that coincided with the party's interests. When they appeared before the commission, those groups identified themselves as ordinary Californians and did not disclose their ties to the party, end quote. What's being done to ensure that this doesn't happen again? And does anyone, I know it's early in the process, but are you aware of that, and what's being done to make sure we're not getting AstroTurf groups there?
Yeah, I think we're aware of we're certainly aware of the article that was written, certainly aware that was a part of the process. You know, the best thing we can do is have our eyes wide open and have genuine outreach to community groups. And I think that's why we're taking so seriously our work to actually do outreach to groups. We are trying our best to figure out a way to actually engage groups and even have a grant making program to ensure that community groups on the ground can be engaged. You know, so certainly we are aware that was a process. I think that's probably happening on both sides of the aisle, if I had to guess correctly. And something that we'll have to just keep our eyes open for. At the end of the day, however, if a member of the public wants to come and provide testimony to us, we are going to receive it and think about it and try to give equal weight to every piece of information that comes in. And we're well aware that just because one kind of community of interest testimony might be given over and over and over again, that doesn't mean that an individual who comes, you know, wholeheartedly and gives their testimony for their community, that shouldn't be weighed into consideration as well. And so we're absolutely aware of that. You know, as I mentioned, in terms of us setting up our internal processes, much of that is staffing, but also data management, right? So that we can understand and hopefully be able to create the internal process to assess the data that we receive so that we can see, okay, hey, we've received this same exact testimony 10 times over from 3 different people or multiple different sources. And this clearly is going to be some sort of coordinated effort. So we're going to be keeping an eye out for that. But at the end of the day, if a person wants to come and submit testimony, we're here to receive it. And we'll do our best to sort through it in a transparent process and receive all of that public testimony publicly. And so I think if people are watching and have concerns about testimony, they're welcome to weigh in on that as well. And we've actually already begun to see some of that. You know, we'll see some public comment come in and then a counter public comment come in. So we're preparing ourselves for that for sure.
Is there, this is probably a question for Alejandra and Mindy, but whomever wants to weigh in. Who are you most concerned about, but given the preliminary numbers we've seen, about losing representation in the legislature in terms of demographic groups? I know 10 years ago when it's covering redistricting, there was a lot of concern, particularly from the Black community in Los Angeles, about losing seats in the legislature. Where are your concerns this time about who might be losing representation in the legislature?
So among our partners in the Alliance, I mean, we are cognizant about like just the potential conflict and challenges, right? I think that something that we've been very mindful of is like our approach and really thinking about it in a multiracial equity approach, right? I think that one, we recognize that there are communities that, you know, given the demographic changes, you know, like the Latinx community, they've increased, you know, their size, you know, in certain areas that, you know, are predominantly or historically Black communities. And so, so just being mindful of like, how do you balance that? How do you ensure, you know, that I think for us as an alliance, we're really thinking about how do we ensure that we have representation for all groups and that not one group, you know, gains more at the expense of the other, right? And I think like when we think about equity, right, it's like, even though relatively speaking population size, you know, we might say, oh, well, the Black community is smaller. However, they're also being more impacted by a lot of disparities, right? And it doesn't make them any less, you know, valuable or important for them to have representation. It's like, how do we ensure that communities have a voice? And so I think that there are concerns. I think that there are partners that are working, you know, directly with certain communities that, you know, might be impacted one way or another. And I think that's going to be kind of like the challenge as an alliance together. Like, how do we advance, you know, how do we advance and advocate for lines that really will benefit, you know, communities as a whole, and be able to strengthen their position, you know, of political power, you know, moving forward. And so that, I think it's going to be a question that we're navigating, that we're thinking about, that a lot of spaces are thinking about, but then ultimately, like, how is it that we are not advancing in a way that it's hurting someone else? And so that's how we're at least grappling with it and thinking about it in those terms of like multiracial, but also like equity and racial equity lens.
Mindy, do you want to add something?
Well, I can't say it, I think, more eloquently than Alejandra, but maybe what I'll add to it is, you know, certainly we, you know, the gaming out of redistricting has, you know, began a long time ago, and people have certainly trying to figure out, bottom line, what's the difference going to be in terms of districts, right, and power, and elected officials in terms of their what they might be facing with the likelihood of, you know, how it impacts their reelection, for instance, that sort of thing. But really what we're talking about here today, what we have been talking about, what's really most important, which is communities having input in an equitable way, in a full way, in a respectful way. But I'll add that I think in the end, the process also has to be trusted, right? So not everybody's going to get what they want. Not every advocacy group or community group is going to get the lines drawn in the ways that they feel that they want it, or even feel that it best represents them. But the process is transparent. I mean, that's why we have a Citizens Redistricting Commission, but it also very much needs extensive, wide engagement, like the work that Advancement Project is doing, to get people to the table, to educate them about it, to have real meaningful, full engagement, informed engagement. So, you know, it's the data, and then it's everything else, and it's, you know, having communities of interest fully represented, and that's no small task. And at the end of the day, you know, when we're through this process, it's, do the people that were engaged in it, were they really representative of California, and do they feel good about the process? Did they trust the process? And what can we learn from that going forward? Like, we learned a lot from 2010. That's the only other thing I'd add.
We have a couple questions from the audience I want to mix in as we're winding down here. Someone asks, please say more about the relevance and role of the Voting Rights Act in drawing new lines. Who wants to take that one? Sarah, do you want to take that? Go ahead.
Sure. And I think I can't open my video, but that's okay. Oh, maybe I can. The Voting Rights Act is the second criteria that we have to follow in drawing district lines following equal population. So that is something we take very seriously. We've had multiple presentations and trainings at the commission to ensure that commissioners are aware of the provisions of the Voting Rights Act, as they can be confusing, particularly in a state like California, where we have multiple groups that could fall under compliance with the VRA. We're also actively in the process of finalizing a contract for a Voting Rights Act attorney to specifically provide legal guidance as we engage in this process and to begin our assessment of VRA compliant districts, where they lie currently. And once we have census data and further analysis of the CVAP data, where we will need to begin drawing them. So most certainly this is something that is on our radar and that we take very, very seriously, and can begin this work actually this summer prior to the release of census data is the plan. So certainly stay tuned. We'll be discussing it in detail over the next several months in our meetings.
I wanted to add, you were talking about the diversity of the commission, and it is the first, correct me if I'm wrong, the first statewide redistricting commission that has a majority of women on it, correct?
That's right. That's right. We're bringing some girl power to redistricting.
And not only that, but this commission is so diverse that you have found Republicans from Berkeley and Oakland. You must have found the only Republicans in town. How'd you find those people?
Right. That's right. That's right.
Okay. Another audience question. Someone asked, if we are interested in economic equity, why shouldn't the aim be to reach all low-income communities equally and increase all of their rates of participation? Alejandra, you want to take that one?
Yes, thank you for the person who uplifted that question. So it says I cannot start my video. So whenever you are able to open my video, okay.
Should be able to do it now.
There we go. Perfect. Cool. So, I mean, I think when it comes to economic equity, I mean, it's critical to understand, that there's a lot of folks that are suffering, in terms of poverty, and it's cutting across, different groups. And that's something that's important. And I think that, for low income communities, they face a lot of barriers, to just being able to engage, when you're struggling just to make, ends meet, for your community. But when you zoom into, low-income communities, and you break it down by race, you see the disparities even further, right? And you really have to think about, when it comes to equity, it's not just economic, but it's like economic and racial. When you look at, different population groups, if it's either, you're thinking about gender, groups with disabilities, different like income levels, when you cut by race, for the most part, that's when you continue to see how acute disparities really turn out to be. And that, it's not about having an equal playing field, because equal doesn't mean that everybody's at the same starting point. And I think that that's something that we need to really be conscious and center in terms of approaching, when it comes to redistricting, thinking about who are those communities that are suffering, that have barriers, and who are those that even have even bigger barriers, based on, not just income, but also, based on race and ethnicity, language, being immigrant born, or immigrant community, English limited proficiency, like all of these different things, when you think of in the intersectionality of a person, and how everything comes into play, there's some community groups that are going to have higher levels of barriers to overcome relatively to others, right? And so how do you engage and how do you develop a process that really, one, addresses, economic barriers, but also fine tunes and thinks about it, how is it broken down even by race and ethnicity, right? And how do you attempt, to create a process that's inclusive and that is responsive, and that is able to navigate and actually adjust to what you need, in order to engage everybody, right? But not everybody's is not in the same plane, is not in the same boat, and so that's something that is critical to understand, and it's not just being equal but equitable.
We have time for maybe one more question, and it's an audience question. Other than the statewide implications, can the panelists discuss the likely impacts on local redistricting efforts like the county, city, BART, other special districts. This affects more than the redistricting, as we say, more than the House districts, more than the legislature. Do you want to, this is, I've been spending all week talking about it to register as a voter across the street for a story that's coming in the Chronicle on Sunday. And they're kind of freaked out about the timeline here because of all the lines that they have to draw. Who wants to jump on this? Would that be? I think that might be our commissioner right after. Commissioner, would you like to take on that one?
So, oh, sorry. So the question has to do with local redistricting?
Yeah. How does this affect? How does what else? Because there's other things involved, like counties and such.
Yeah.
How does it involve that? What's going to be the effect on that? Those lines have to be redrawn as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
And about a minute left.
Sure that some of the panelists in the next panel can also probably speak to this, as I'm quite certain they're involved in the local efforts. We've done a little bit of outreach to some of the local redistricting commissions. And I think one of the challenges is that the different commissions function differently. So their levels of independence are different in different places. So for example, the city of Los Angeles, ultimately their commission develops the lines and then gives it to the legislature to approve or not, right? So they're operating on a very different kind of timeline, given the kinds of authority that they have. So certainly, I think that if there's opportunities for us to work together, share resources, we are most certainly open to that and have been having conversations with different commissions. But ultimately, they're separate processes. And so I think one of the lessons learned for 2030 is how do we share, particularly as we see more independent commissions at the local level, how do we share some of those resources so that someone who comes out to give their testimony about where their community lies, it could be used in multiple, for multiple redistricting efforts. Unfortunately, I don't know that we're at that point of coordination this time around, but certainly something to keep in mind for the future. And ultimately, I think a lot of the different commissions will have different timelines that they're working under.
All right, panelists, thank you all. And we will be taking a short break until the next panel starts at 3 o'clock. David?
That is correct. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Joe. That was a terrific panel. We're taking a 15-minute break. We'll reconvene at 3 o'clock. I'm going to pause the recording as soon as I'm done speaking, but panelists, please note, even though we're not being recorded, we're not going back into the practice session green room. So you should probably turn off your video and your microphones, because if you start kibitzing, everyone can hear you. See you guys all back at 3 o'clock. Pausing recording. Resuming recording. All right, everyone, welcome back. It's 3 o'clock, starting our second session of the day, translating data into districts. Introducing our moderators, Seema. I'm not even gonna make the mistake of mangling your last name. I'll let you do that for yourself. Take it away, Seema. Let's go with the second panel.
Great. It's Seema Mehta, so spelled pretty much like it's, or pronounced pretty much like it's spelled. But thank you so much for having me. And also I'm looking forward to talking to all of our guests about redistricting on this lovely Friday afternoon. So we're going to talk about translating data into districts, reflections on the last redistricting cycle, and sort of the discussions of the unique challenges and opportunities facing the new commission. And this has already been a crazy year. The census has delayed the data so long. So it's already a very complicated process. It seems like there's a lot more questions and about how crazy this year is going to be. So I'd like to introduce our panel. First of all, we have Samuel Wang, who's a professor of neuroscience at Princeton and the founder of the Princeton Gerrymandering Project. We have Cynthia Dye, CEO of, and I hope I'm pronouncing this properly, CEO of Dynamic Consulting and a former commissioner on the California Citizens Redistricting Commission. And then we have two Californians who are very familiar to anybody who follows redistricting in the state, Paul Mitchell, the Vice President of Political Data, Inc., and Matt Rexford, the Chief Counsel for Redistricting Insights. So before we get started, if anybody in the audience has any questions, you can ask them at any time, but please post them in the Q&A function, not the chat function, so we all see them. And with that, I would like to turn to Professor Wang. And I just want to, first of all, find out more about the voting, the gerrymandering project that you founded. And also, if you could speak about how citizens can be involved, how they can participate in this project, in redistricting, across the nation, what Californians can learn from what other states are doing. And then also, if you could speak to whether there are any particular advantages or disadvantages with having a redistricting commission, an independent redistricting commission.
Of course. Thanks for having me, Seema. Thanks for having me, everyone, and delighted to join this group. I have to say the first session was super interesting, and some of the things I'm going to say are somewhat redundant there, and so I would hesitate to be too redundant with that. Would it be okay if I showed some slides? Why don't I go ahead and do that then? All right, so let me see if I can get this to work. Let's see, let's get this to work. Let me just start off by saying that redistricting is this peculiar problem that we have in the United States where, let me just get this going here. Actually, let me just stop sharing that for a second. Redistricting is a peculiar problem in the United States because, unusual among democracies, line drawing is in the hands of the people who themselves hold office. And so state legislators in most states will be in control of drawing the lines, and then they choose their constituents and thereby strategically create, you know, maybe fair districts, maybe representative districts, but maybe partisan districts that favor either individual incumbents or perhaps even a whole political party. And I will say that here at Princeton, we are very interested in fair districting. And I've started a project called the Princeton Gerrymandering Project, which has as its mission helping people with data, law, analytics, and research to really create the fairest process possible, to really assist in fair districting. And we do this all over the country. Just to get out front, the fact that California has a wonderful process, it's really been a pioneering process that serves as an example to the whole nation because of efforts like those of Commissioner Dye, former Commissioner Dye, and others, where a commission structure is formed that requires taking public input, that requires a supermajority to pass a plan, that requires either Democrats and Republicans working together or independents working with either party, that requires votes that span the political spectrum to create an approved map. And that's for legislative and congressional maps. And so in many ways, there are problems that I think that have been really, in some ways, addressed very well by California, under perhaps some threat by the Supreme Court, depending on what happens with the drawing of congressional districts, which is a subject we can talk about during question and answer. But with that, let me just give you a bird's eye view perhaps of what's happening across the nation, because I think that what I can really contribute today is to tell you just a little bit about what's happening across the entire nation. Let me make sure I can get this going. So let me just, oops, okay, here we go. Let me just get this right. And so my project at Princeton is the Princeton Gerrymandering Project, as you heard. It's part of a larger project called the Electoral Innovation Lab. And really, we are working to help people build more representative and more responsive electoral processes in every domain, whether it be redistricting or voting rules such as ranked choice voting, or coming up with better approaches to understanding things like campaign finance. And so we're part of a larger project. And all of these things at the bottom of the screen are various things that we've spawned. And a couple of them I think are pretty relevant to what you all are going to go through and what we nationwide are going to go through in redistricting. And this map on the right is just a map of all the different rules that are in use. And so you can see here, this sort of cyan color that's California is a commission system that's in use in a number of states around the country, Arizona, which came a little bit before California, Alaska, Montana, Washington, more recently Colorado and Michigan. And so that's one kind of redistricting rule that's a system that's in place. And you can see that other states have other kinds of systems. Some places have split party control, that's like Pennsylvania and Wisconsin. Other places have commissions appointed by politicians. That would be places like New York and New Jersey. And then Virginia is sort of both, actually, it's miscolored here. But the point is that we have this crazy quilt of rules for how districts are drawn around the country. And I would say one thing that I think that is perhaps interesting to residents of California is just how many systems there are around the country. And I think watching those is in some ways a cautionary tale for ways things could go wrong. And, you know, things that you can keep in mind as you, I hope, are actually, I hope, relatively pleased about your system. But the one thing about the California system is it really requires active citizen engagement, as we heard on the previous panel. And that active citizen input is absolutely critical. It needs to come from all different sectors, Democrats, Republicans, and independents. So just to give you a sense of it, when my group started getting interested in gerrymandering, or rather redistricting, it was caused by gerrymandering, the unfair drawing of districts for advantage, which is something that's gone back several hundred years. And you're welcome to look on Google if you like and look up this article I wrote that really launched our interest in the subject, which we published in 2013. describing the fact that there was this unprecedented slew of gerrymanders drawn across the country, the largest number of partisan gerrymanders really in the age of voting rights over the last 60 years, the largest number ever. And we got really interested in the fact that it was possible for a majority of voters nationwide to not elect a majority of legislators to Congress. And this national gerrymander really got my attention in ways in which the process can go off track. And so my team has been interested in developing statistical measures of gerrymandering that can catch them. I will say that the last time there was a really big one was the biggest one ever was probably the one in the 1980s in California that I think several of you who've been involved in redistricting for a while know very well, overseen by the political boss Phil Burton. That was a really good one. That was one in the 1980s. Since that time, gerrymanders have really taken off, and really in the 2000s and 2010s, it's really exploded. And I think there's been a huge amount of interest nationwide in basically finding ways to stem that, to find different ways to curb that practice, either through bipartisanship, through independent commissions, or through rules that can hold back bad offenses. So I think, as you all know, redistricting, the jump ball, as it were, started with the release of census data. This is a piece that an associate and I, Zach Sippy and I, wrote for The Hill. You can look it up, that we published just last week, where we said that, reapportionment is only really the beginning of the story. So it may be that some states won seats, other states lost seats, gained seats and lost seats, but that really doesn't determine fairness. The process by which fair or unfair districts are drawn really comes to the commissions and the structures that do that drawing. And really there can be hidden surprises. And so, as you heard in the previous panel, California may lose a Democratic seat in Congress. It may lose a Republican seat in Congress. By sheer numbers, it'll be more likely to lose a Democratic seat, but so much is held in the process. And as you heard from the commissioner in the previous session, that process is not concerned necessarily with who gains and who loses on a partisan basis. It's concerned with representing communities and parties. And I think that's really, in some ways, an ideal system in which the citizens have a say. And I would say that that's the ideal to aspire to. Many states don't have that kind of system in place and are heavily reliant on public input. Now, one thing that's of great interest, I think, nationally is the fact that the census may have made undercounts in certain key communities. I know that Eric Mcgee got an excellent question in the last session. I will say that overall, the census did surprisingly well on average, where the count came in within 0.7 percentage point of estimates based on the previous census, where if you take previous census numbers, take births, deaths, and international migration, the count ended up within less than a percentage point of previous estimates. That doesn't mean it's perfect. It turns out that there may have been an undercount in certain states rich in Hispanics, such as Texas, Florida, and Arizona, and maybe they were deprived of seats because of that. California did not suffer from this. In California, you all had a really strong get out the count effort, and I would say that California's count came in very close to on the button relative to estimates before the census. We'll have a piece in the Washington Post. It's already online, but it's going to be in the print edition of the Washington Post this weekend for those of you who can get a copy of that. And I'll be glad to talk about the census count. So let me get to the point, and someone's going to have to stop me from going too far over time, too close to time. Broadly speaking, redistricting has over the decades has been really a private process with private and unshared data, software that costs thousands of dollars, and done behind closed doors. And that's this upper row of white boxes here. And really, I think technological innovation and reforms across the country, such as you have in California, have really opened up the floodgates to really create a lot of opportunity for citizen input, where data is available publicly, in our case at openprecincts.org, but in other organizations around the country are serving up free data, such as Dave's Redistricting app. There are open tools for redistricting, such as Dave's Redistricting. There are open input tools, as you saw. Corinne McDonald is a leader, and all the technology developers in California in creating tools for citizen input for reporting communities of interest. We've developed a tool that's useful in all states that are not California, and that's at representable.org. And there are, again, other organizations around the country that have created tools for that. And reformers, citizens, litigators, and journalists can all use these technological tools, hopefully to generate a fairer outcome. And really all this technology is, I would say, it plays a similar role to what the iPhone has done for the Black Lives Matter movement and for other ways of reporting actions and to bring in citizens into the journalistic process. I think that these technological innovations can really be put in the hands of all citizens to shine a light similarly on redistricting. And so I think the main message is that, and just to show you here some examples of things that hopefully you'll never see in California, sort of a rogues gallery of redistricting unfairness. And this is just to show you the kinds of things that can happen, except for the Ohio 9th district. Every single one of these districts here is landlocked. There is no water boundary around, no body of water around any of these districts. And so this is just to give you a sense of the kinds of things that can be done in the name of pursuing advantage for an incumbent or for a political party. Now, my team at Princeton has engaged in creating, as I say, data and technology tools, citizen input tools such as Representable, and really partnering in any way using law, technology, and math. And we'd be delighted to be in touch with any of you. I will say that California has an unusual gathering of expertise. I know that people like Eric Mcgee are providing valuable service to the commission itself. We're more engaged with helping communities and individuals. So we're more like we're on the outside looking in. And we'd love to be of assistance to anybody who's on this call. I'll just say that that we are developing things like a fair districting dashboard. And so this is in response to a question about how we can prevent offenses from being committed. A dashboard that measures partisan fairness, racial fairness, make sure that shapes like geographic features don't look too out of whack. We're developing a dashboard that we hope is going to be of service and we hope can be as simple as taking a draft plan, dragging it and dropping it into a web browser and really creating a measure of fairness metrics. There are pioneering organizations like Plan Score, which is an organization that's dedicated to calculating partisan fairness. Eric Mcgee's been involved in that. We're dedicated to creating a more full dashboard full of measures that can measure not just partisan fairness, but a number of other things as well. These things have to be quantified in ways that are comprehensible to regular people. We had a piece, we talked to a reporter in Pennsylvania and recently came up with measures that go into this dashboard. And we talked to her, Marie Albagus. She's a wonderful reporter. And I would say she's a great person to follow on that front. It's important to have these metrics because a pretty looking map can really generate a fair or unfair outcome. These are population density maps of Pennsylvania, which is pretty close to where I live here in New Jersey. And the left-hand map doesn't look too bad, but it creates a super partisan map that's 13-5 favoring Republicans. The right-hand map is about as pretty, and it creates a delegation in Congress that's 9-9. And Pennsylvania, I think as most of you know, is a 50-50 state. And so the right-hand map treats people more fairly. And it just goes to show that it's really important to keep on top of these things. And citizen input is a really super important part of that. I will say that the Representable team at Princeton has created a wonderful tool that I hope that people will use. We've had people like Beto O'Rourke get super interested in it. And so we're really interested in serving communities around the country. Let me just close by saying that, that it's also important to have ways to quantify measures of whether communities have been split. And up here in the upper right corner is an example of how Flushing and Flushing and Bayside, which are Asian American rich communities in Queens, New York City, have been split over the years. And finally, in the last redistricting cycle, have escaped being split. And what we've done is we've got a journal article in a law journal in the Stanford Journal of Civil Rights and Civil Liberties. We've come up with ways of rigorously counting how many times a community of interest has been split. And we think that our metric, which is we call effective splits, which is illustrated in the lower right-hand corner, says that if you take a community of interest and you split it 3 ways, that's super bad. And that's effectively splitting the community 2 ways, 2 times, as opposed to just shaving a little bit off the corner, which you might do by accident. That's 0.18 effective split, not nearly so bad. And so I think that one measure that I hope is going to be useful for people on this call, people who are going to be engaged in redistricting, is the ability to take those communities of interest that are reported through Corinne McDonald's and company's tool, reported through Representable's tool, and take those splits and turn them into a quantifiable measure where you can go to your commission and say, Commissioner, you've split our community here in Inglewood, or here in Menlo Park, or here in Oakland, and you split it too many times, and could you please not do that? And so we're hoping that this index of effective splitting is going to be useful to you on California and around the country. Because of time, I'm not going to get into it. We're also interested in remediating undercounts. I'm not going to get into that because I want to stop talking too much. But just to close by saying that we've got capacity here, and we're hoping to be useful to you all out there with law and data, with analytics, with instant scoring of draft plans, and maybe even spinning up local expertise. And so I'm hoping that we'll have a robust discussion today. And I will stop there and hand it over to the next speaker or to the moderator.
Thank you so much. That was very helpful. And I feel like I have a lot of story ideas that I want to talk to you about after this call.
Outstanding.
One of the things, actually, when you showed those gerrymandered districts, it reminded me of California's Ribbon of Shame, I believe it was called, in the Santa Barbara area. And part of the reason we don't have that anymore is because we have this independent commission who redrew lines 10 years ago. And so with that, I'd like to turn to Cynthia Dye, a member of that former commission. And I just want to talk to you about your experiences on the commission and sort of what you learned, especially about the Voting Rights Act, the definition of communities of interest, and how did your commission approach that? One of the things your commission had to get pre-clearance of some, I think of, pardon me if I'm not using the exact right words, but you had to get pre-clearance from the DOJ for certain districts. And now because of the Supreme Court ruling, this new commission won't have to do that. Like, do you think that'll change the way that they approach these maps? And just sort of any advice you have about, for this new commission and how they should take on this task, particularly with this sort of weird time crunch that they have that you did not have.
Sure. Thanks very much for having me on this panel. I'm actually speaking to you from Tahoe, as you can tell. I'm going to try to keep my prepared remarks brief. You've asked me to comment specifically about how the First Commission dealt with the Voting Rights Act and communities of interest. Karin, in the previous panel, had already reviewed the CRC's rank ordered criteria. And as you know, we have 2 federal criteria and 4 state criteria. Both the Voting Rights Act, which is criteria number 2, and communities of interest, which are part of criteria number 4, require a great deal of judgment and are not as definitive as, say, the number 1 criterion of population equality. On the VRA, as you mentioned, Seema, California had 4 covered counties subject to Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act, which required approval from the Justice Department to ensure that new districts did not make it harder for minorities to elect a candidate of their choice, where they had been a long history of discrimination and voting rights violations. We had to deal with the Section 5 counties very carefully to ensure that they passed muster with DOJ or risk having the entire state maps thrown out. As a result, we drew these districts first and treated them as immovable puzzle pieces. As you mentioned, the Supreme Court essentially invalidated this provision in the 2013 Shelby versus Holder decision, so the new CRC will not have to contend with this. As a result, I think they will have some nicer looking districts and be able to better respond to community input. I will never forget a man who testified before us in a cowboy hat about how his corner of Monterey County had no roads connecting to his representative, and he urged us to split the county and put his town where there were roads. Unfortunately, we were not able to accommodate his request due to Section 5. We next devoted significant time to compliance with Section 2 of the VRA. This was an exercise in drawing sufficient majority-minority districts to give distinct communities fair voice per the law. This means being careful to draw communities together, not cracking them, but simultaneously not packing them into a smaller number of districts, which might deny them additional representation. Another challenge in California, which Commissioner Sadwani mentioned, is that unlike the southern states that inspired the VRA, which are mostly Black and white, California has many different minority groups of significant population. My distinct first impression when we looked at census data with color-coded dots representing African Americans, Latinx, and Asians in Southern California was that it looked like a Jackson Pollock painting. We had to balance many competing interests, but we were sometimes able to engineer elegant solutions. In a now famous example, when presented with conflicting testimony from advocates for these communities, we suggested that they actually talk to each other rather than forcing us to split the baby. They presented us with a so-called unity map the next day after collaboratively working through hard compromises. Another example, we avoided splitting the Koreatown Business District and African American communities in LA, which ended up actually being in predominantly Latinx districts. We took a similar approach to communities of interest, with the additional work of having to determine if each community of interest was in fact legitimate. That is, with shared social, cultural, and/or economic interests that merited consideration for shared representation. In other words, we didn't accept a COI just on someone's say-so, but based it on the evidence presented to us. And as part of our fourth rank criteria, we also needed to consider if preserving county, city, or neighborhood lines was more important than keeping a community whole. Many communities were small relative to district sizes, such as Somali refugees or LGBT communities, and it was a simple matter of noting where they were when drawing the lines to avoid accidentally splitting them. Where we knew we would have to split a larger community, we would ask for input from the community as to where a judicious line could be drawn. Likewise, we sought testimony about other nearby communities with whom they shared similar interests, so these COIs could be grouped together in districts for more effective representation. We did have to make hard trade-offs, elevating certain communities above others in certain situations. There, we carefully consider where people's interests were most relevant. For example, if the issues of concern were at the federal level, for example, environmental watersheds, we would prioritize those communities for congressional districts. Otherwise, we tried to keep them together at the Assembly or Senate level. We considered if they had been historically split in previous redistricting processes, something Sam mentioned, like the Vietnamese neighborhood in San Jose. Lastly, we considered the greater good. By keeping one community whole, how many other communities did it force us to split? What was absolutely important to us was that we upheld the public's trust in our decision-making process and that they understood our rationale. The CRC is required to publish a report at the end justifying the reasons for each of the districts that we create. We did it for each of the 177 districts we drew in the 2010 process, and I'm confident that we fulfilled the mandate to ensure fair representation for all Californians. The 2020 CRC will undoubtedly face many similar challenges. While we successfully lobbied to give them significantly more time than we had to do a good job for all Californians, the pandemic, a bungled census, and the loss of a congressional seat are new obstacles with which we did not have to contend. I do need to correct Commissioner Sadwani on one point. The 2010 CRC did, in fact, conduct a few public input hearings before census data was received or processed as well. We just didn't have nearly as much time before the data did come in. My recommendation to them has been to front load the process as much as possible, taking this time before census data is available to aggressively reach out to underserved communities in particular to ensure they have as much solid data about communities of interest as possible so they're ready to move swiftly. And it sounds like that's exactly what they've been doing. So I'm going to leave it at there and look forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much for your input. That was very helpful. So with that, I want to turn to Paul Mitchell. First of all, to just, if you could lay out what is at stake with redistricting this time. What did we learn? What did you learn from 2010? And just given your experience with redistricting over the years, which communities of interest do you feel like are really engaged right now? Who needs to be, who should the state be working at, to reach out to get more engagement? Just, what are the, some of the opportunities and risks in the public process in the current context when we can't meet in public or meet together? Especially if you're talking about underserved communities who might not have, as much internet access or broad, how do you do redistricting in this current environment?
All righty. Well, I'll start off by getting into some of these. I've done a little presentation here. Hopefully you guys can see it. So first off, the commission, the what's at stake question. What's literally at stake is the drawing of 172 districts plus the Board of Equalization. So Assembly, Senate, Congressional, and then the lowly 4 Board of Equalization seats. It's also beyond that literal aspect of the process, the actual line drawing. It's also confronting the changing populations in the state, both the population growth. We know the total size of the state population based on the apportionment, but how the state has changed within it, the intra California population shifts, and engaging those populations to make sure that they have a public process, like you mentioned, in this really challenging time with COVID, and doing it in a compressed window on the tail end, but really an open, long, lengthy period on the front end. So kind of the opposite of the timeframes that were available to the last commission. So those are the primary things that are at stake, but also what's at stake is the future of independent commission redistricting. The stage was really set by this commission for a significant expansion of the commission process. And we see it going out kind of horizontally across the country and also vertically down to local governments. And this commitment to this process has been enhanced by the work of the last commission. I think it's incumbent on the next commission to see that as one of the things that they need to leave behind. The last commission process was interesting because at first, nobody knew what it was going to be like. Those of us on the outside thought they might just be like, 14 judges that would go into chambers and draw lines. Others, felt that if they did go up and testify, that the commission might be constantly second guessing everything that they're seeing. When we look at the time as it was developing, I viewed it as being a few real things that the commission was focused on in general. And it's great having Commissioner Dye on here. And I'll be watching her reactions as I go through these. But the first was the slay the dragon idea. And that was that the last commission, the existing lines were the enemy. And when we think about that, when Sam Wang went through his presentation, he brought up the original gerrymander. And they wanted to get rid of those. And one of them was the 20th Senate District, I believe, in 22nd Senate District in LA, which went from San Marino through South Pasadena and all the way down into LA. And to my mind, always looked like the original gerrymander. So it's got the talons, it's got the wings, it's got the head. And there were others. Seema mentioned one earlier, which was the ribbon of shame. And I have this map up here, but most people can probably only see 3 districts, but there's a 4th there. And it is that narrow 200-mile stretch of a district that went, all the way along the coast. And they jokingly said that it disappeared at high tide. So when we were watching the commission process work, this idea of, the enemy was the status quo was really prevalent in a lot of what they were doing in their process. The second thing was a real deep need to make sure that it stuck. That meant making sure that they didn't fail. And the biggest kind of existential threat to the commission at the time was Section 5. It wasn't that the commission couldn't draw great districts, and it's not that the commission couldn't draw districts that empowered underrepresented minority populations, or that wasn't their goal the whole time. It was the fear that when plans were sent to the Department of Justice, that they would be either pre-cleared or not. And if they weren't pre-cleared, then the plans would be sent back to California with no way for the commission under statute to kind of come back and reconfigure themselves, draw plans in a different timeline. There just wasn't the structure for that. So the plans would likely go to the courts for changes. So in a way, one important thing they had to do was to make sure that they went to all those districts that touched any of those Section 5 counties and made sure they weren't retrogressing, which is the technical term, those minority populations, And in a very real way, this shaped the overall plan in California. The Central Valley, Monterey, and Kings and Merced counties, when you draw those counties essentially in a way where you're kind of fixing them based on these numeric values, you're blocking off the ability to move population up and down the coast along the 1 or the 5 or the 99. So it's kind of what I like to call a defensive redistricting in that part. The third was setting the stage, and they did successfully set the stage nationally and local government for the creation of commissions and open, fair redistricting processes, and it has grown. We're doing redistricting partners, redistricting for City of Long Beach, Berkeley, Oakland, all using independent redistricting commissions, and a number of others that are using advisory committees and embracing the Fair Maps Act, which was born out of a lot of the principles of the state commission. So what's the next commission going to do? What's this incoming group going to do? And Commissioner Sadwani isn't on, so I can't see her reactions to what I say here. But my first thought is, are they going to find some dragons? Are they going to find things in the map that they think they need to fix? Or are they going to view the status quo of the existing districts having been drawn by the last commission as being not as much the enemy as before? How are they going to deal post Section 5? The elimination of Section 5 could in some ways actually allow them to create some better Section 2 majority and minority districts and allow them to create better districts in areas where the last commission might have felt that their hands were a little bit tied. In our expectation, we might see among the Assembly, Senate, and congressional plans 10 more majority minority districts, and then maintain the reputation. I think this existing commission needs to prove that they can continue to be successful in order to continue this trend nationally and in California's local government to having this more public facing, not behind the scenes redistricting process. So how this is done, especially in this environment, the real issue is, can they really get into community of interest testimony and utilize the time now to create those building blocks that are going to go into the creation of new plans? And there are three things essentially that they need the public to come in and tell them. Who is their community? How do you identify it geographically? Like, how can it be mapped? And why does that community matter for the agency that is being redistricted? And so as an example, the community. I like to joke about my mom's left-handed. She's part of the left-handed community, right? They have the funny scissors and the can openers, and they don't like sitting at the movie theater. I don't know, something like that. So, but can you map left-handed people? No. And do they have like a special need? Probably not before the legislature or Congress. But as Commissioner Dye mentioned, the LGBTQ community was active in the last redistricting, is active in this redistricting. They are a community with shared characteristics and things that bind them together. They are a community that can be mapped. There are areas with geographic density, and they are a community that is subject to state, federal policies or inaction by state and federal governments. And so when we're doing redistricting a community like that, in addition to the historic Voting Rights Act communities, Latinos, Asians, African Americans, they all can be brought into this process during this long period that we have for their early testimony. Those protected classes, like I mentioned, are the primary groups that the commission will have to deal with in areas where there are specific federal Voting Rights Act concerns. And the commission is doing a good job right now of going out and identifying those and making sure they have counsel on board to do that. Other communities of interest could be neighborhoods or students. There can be things that are more about like a collective experience, people who experience noise pollution or air pollution, access to economic benefits or educational opportunities, transportation. All these things can be other communities of interest that can meet those three criteria. They can be identified with shared characteristics, they can be mapped, and they can point to how their community is impacted by the governance of the agency that's being redistricted. How we do this, we want to keep those communities into districts and to empower them in elections And we want to use mapping like the state has, maybe community interest forums, which we use a lot in local government, and public testimony to figure those out. We have a lot of agencies now that you can go. This one is Burlingame. You can go on their website and you can fill out a community of interest form that's like a survey. Most of the cities and counties we're working with are having these forms. There's online tools. Most of the cities and counties we're working with and the state have online mapping tools. And California's tool you saw earlier, Karen McDonald showed that a little bit in her presentation. It wasn't Karen, it was Commissioner Sadwani, I believe. There are other tools as well. Representable, which has been mentioned, District R, Days Redistricting app. There's all these tools, and it's important for people doing redistricting to kind of be technology agnostic. That if people send them plans in Representable, it should be treated the same as somebody who sends a plan in a program an agency spent $30,000 on, and the equal to somebody who submits a plan on a napkin. The public hearings are going to be challenging in some ways with the with COVID precautions and online, but we'll probably enter a phase in this period where we can start to have some hybrid, where some will be online, some will be in person. And the opportunities abound. We have been talking a lot about state redistricting, but there are dozens of independent redistricting commissions, other advisory committees, public processes, probably going to be thousands of community outreach hearings for all the redistrictings that are happening around the state. And so no matter where you are, there's really no excuse not to engage. And engaging does, in a way, help propagate these commissions and this process into the future, because if these are successful, then we're going to see it expand. If they're not successful, this is going to be that silly era where we had commissions doing redistricting and it'll go by the wayside. I'm hoping that this is part of a growth of this, not only in the state, but nationally. And with that, I will stop my sharing.
Thank you. I hope you can hear. You guys can hear me. Thank you so much, Paul, for sort of laying out what's at stake this year. And if anybody in the audience has any questions, just a reminder to please put them in the Q&A channel, and not the chat function. So with that, we're going to turn to Matt Rexford. And I just wanted to see, with all your experience over the years with local and state redistricting, what are some of the best practices in terms of ensuring transparency and equity in the public input process? Specifically, to put a little bit of a sharper point on it, I mean, I think some people would argue that partisans were able to influence or tried to influence the commission last time around. And because the commission is supposed to be not political, they're not supposed to be a bunch of elected officials, they maybe didn't know that so-and-so is somebody's field director or somebody's legislative staffer. So how do you stop partisans from trying to influence, or to make sure the commission knows who exactly is trying to influence them? And then also, just given that you're the last speaker, could you, any thoughts you have about the previous speaker's remarks would be greatly appreciated.
Sure. So today has been awesome in terms of everyone's presentations regarding redistricting and how it's changing. And in California, it's been over 10 years. 10 years ago, when the 2011 commission went through, they really kind of established a new standard for redistricting, and it's more so than just the state. That's really spread. And Paul's statements, I think he was exactly right. We're on a one-way street right now to more independent and at least more advisory, and then certainly more independent commissions, even at the local level. And that trend's going to continue. He's listed some that they're spreading to for local jurisdictions like Santa Barbara and other places, but in San Diego. But more and more, you're going to see commissions come to fruition in cities, and I don't see any of them going back the other way. The other thing, and to tack on to what Paul and Professor Wong mentioned, is that we have all these new technology tools, and 10 years ago, certainly 20 years ago, I would work for the state legislature, and I had this maptitude system, and I was one of just a few people in the state who could really draw maps really effectively, and I could do it, but very few other people could. And so there was this great power of technology that gave us almost a monopoly on an ability to draw maps that had one person population deviation. Well, that's not the case now. Almost like the democratization of finance with Robinhood and all these other things, pretty much anyone can get involved in redistricting now with all these free tools that are available. And it allows people to come to commission meetings completely prepared before. And 10 years ago, Paul and I did the city of Elk Grove together, and we helped this one gentleman who came who had this vision about what Elk Grove should look like, and we drew it out for him with Maptitude, right? We sat down and worked with him. And I think Paul's, one of his comments, which I think is particularly important, is with this new standard in local government redistricting, everyone needs to be welcome to the table, whether you show up with the Dave's redistricting map or something created with Maptitude or a napkin, right? The process has to be set up to help everyone to be involved, because I hate to break this to you all, but if you're on this call, you're a redistricting nerd, right? You care about this, you're sick, you have a problem. We all do. We're gonna get through it. But the reality is that whoever lives 2 doors down from you, and I don't know who those people are in your neighborhood, they're not thinking about redistricting right now. That's not their priority. They're thinking about other things, and we have to be able to welcome all of those people to the table when they decide they want to get involved. And so I often, when I do local government redistricting, or when I was involved in redistricting, when I was a local elected official, we'd hold 5 public hearings, and it'd be the same 10 people that would come to all 5 different meetings, right? It wasn't 50 people, it was 10 people 5 different times. And more now, I think the ability for people to be able to communicate with these online tools is going to change this process rather dramatically. So the 2011 commission kind of set a standard. This commission is being held to that standard, whether they like it or not. That's the reality. And they deserve a lot of credit for an amazing amount of work traveling around the state, going to all of these different meetings. And this commission's decided to tackle this problem very differently so far. They've kind of broken up and split people off, and they're going off and doing Zoom meetings. But the last commission, my recollection is they didn't do a lot of that. Largely it was they were all together in one public meeting, or they weren't in session. And there's going to be some pushback on this commission regarding openness and transparency because of one particular line in the law, which was a ballot measure that I worked on in redistricting when I helped pass Prop 11 and Prop 20, which was commission members and staff may not communicate with or receive communications about redistricting matters from anyone outside of a public hearing. And I think this issue was mentioned by former Commissioner Jody Filkins-Weber a couple meetings ago of the commission, where she pointed this out. Professor Anchetta has mentioned it in a recent letter regarding the way these meetings are conducted. And I say this, and there is some sense of compassion, because as Professor Sidwani mentioned, most of these commissioners have never met each other. All the normal individual group dynamics you would have that, Paul and I watched from afar with Commissioner Dye here 10 years ago, you'd watch the commissioners, they would interact, they'd be able to chat during breaks. They haven't had any of that this time because most of them have never met. A few of them have been in the same room, but it's been pretty rare. And so they're trying to tackle this in new ways. But I think in the end, this law that requires them to do most of their negotiations in open public meetings is going to end up being a problem. And if that continues to persist, it's going to be a problem for commissions, just not for the state commission, but from those throughout the state at the local government level as well. Because everyone wants to talk about, the commission's talked about making redistricting sexy, at least we talked about earlier today, but there's a whole lot of redistrictings going on in water districts and community college districts that aren't in the newspaper, that not a lot of people care about. But the same principles that Professor Wong mentioned apply not only to that local level, but at the state level as well. It's the exact same standard of openness and transparency. And so this commission, because they're in the spotlight, I kind of feel owes an obligation to those other commissions to set a really high standard and hold to it, because it's going to impact everything that trickles down. So I think that's really important. The other thing is that because of this pandemic, this has been a hard process for the commission, and I feel for them in terms of the way they've had to do this via Zoom. Governing with Zoom is very different than trying to govern when you're in open public meetings. And having served in local government for 16 years like I did, the way we've set up our process in California is we have 14 new people every 10 years. And they're all like having 14 new city council members all at the same time. And they've got to build this city and get it started while they're trying to govern. And it's a very difficult process to be able to do that. And oftentimes in local governments that I've been involved with anyway, usually there are some people who are seasoned, who have been around, who are there to help guide them. But where our process is set up, you don't have a lot of that. And oftentimes that can be remedied or mitigated with an experienced city manager or experienced city staff that can help guide them through the process. This commission this time, unfortunately, I was not a fan of this. Mr. Claypool has left and is no longer employed by the commission. His lessons learned from last time would have served this commission very well as they're going through this process together. And as a result of having all of this time that every redistricting process in the country has right now, there's higher expectations about when they roll out this process, as Commissioner Dye mentioned. You got to do a lot of prep work, because when the data comes out, you can't say, well, we're not ready. There's been plenty of time now to prepare, so you've got to be ready to go. You can't say, well, we weren't ready for this. Well, you've had as much notice as you could ever possibly want. You were appointed earlier and you've had all these delays. So the expectations of this commission are going to be extra high. Whether that's fair or not, I believe that they will be held to that expectation early on in the process. The other thing I would point out that I think is really important about this commission and Commissioner Dye and the lessons learned, if you take the chance to read over some of those things, a lot of the comments from the past commission were about the openness and transparency regarding providing transcripts. This commission hasn't provided any transcripts in months for their meetings, which is problematic. It's not searchable. And being able to post their meetings online is really, really helpful. And then we also find out about meetings that have happened that we haven't been there for, nobody had any notice of. And that's going to be a problem. And Seema, an direct answer to your question is, if these problems persist, normally a one-off is not going to be a problem. If problems continue to happen, as mentioned by Commissioner Filkins-Weber and others, it's going to be a problem for not only this commission, but for other commissions in the state of California as well as they go through that. I think that's all I'd like just to close now and take any questions, but I have to tell you that we have, and I'm sorry that Commissioner Sidwani is not still on this call, because I really think she is an amazing commissioner. When you watch these meetings, she is thoughtful and kind, and they're getting through this process all at a very distance learning or distance presentation format. And they have to be dedicated because they're getting on all these very long meetings and doing this. But it's very different than having to leave your home and travel to Sacramento or travel to Los Angeles to have these hearings. And I think the commission meetings are going to change dramatically when you add that travel feature of having to get on a Southwest flight early in the morning and come back late at night and deal with all your family issues. So far, this commission hasn't had to deal with that yet. And that's not an issue for local redistricting, because everyone generally goes home that night. I don't know why anyone would stay over. But this process for California is going to change dramatically as soon as the pandemic conditions lift and when they have to start meeting in person. It's a whole new ballgame at that point. And when you have to stand in front of 100 people who are angry and you've got to cast a vote or do something that doesn't make them happy, that's when you find out, you really have to do a gut check at that point. And we haven't seen that yet, but it'll eventually end up happening.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. So you called us nerds, which I think we are. I would have called us dorks, but we are spending our Friday afternoon talking about redistricting. So how do you convince your neighbor down the street why this matters to them? I mean, personally, when I cover campaigns, people are always super interested in the presidential campaign, and then they don't really care about their school board or their city council when their school board or city council impacts their day-to-day lives so much more than who the president is. So this is an issue I feel like we face in various forms of government, but with redistricting, how do you convince your neighbors who aren't that interested in politics? Like, why is this important? Why should you pay attention to this?
Well, and that was going back to some of the comments that were made about what happened 10 years ago. I remember sitting in some of those commission meetings and watching people walk up to the podium, identify themselves with one attribute. And I would be sitting there thinking, well, yeah, that's true, but you're also a legislative staffer for this other person. And it would be like, that's not a fair representation of who you are. So part of it is people who are politically involved by their nature are drawn to this like a moth to the light. But in terms of the way redistricting works, I do think it's really important in terms of the type of representation you get. And locally where I live here in Woodland, California, we went to district elections for our city, and it changed our city council. We've been a majority Latino community for a long time. Right after we went to district elections, we ended up with a majority Latino city council for the first time ever. And so it does change the outcomes. And for certain parts of my city of Woodland, we ended up with representatives from neighborhoods who had never had a council member ever before. And so it does provide representation and a different level of service for government.
Anybody else want to weigh in on that?
Well, I do believe that the public has wanted this reform. The public has wanted to be able to take the power of drawing districts away from the elected officials and have it be done in a way that is open, transparent, and it really is incumbent upon the public to now step up. So I think that is part of it. But then also it's something that we can all do to show members of the public why it matters. And this opportunity in the next several months of using this as a process for defining your communities, I think is inviting to a lot more people than sitting through 10-hour hearing to go give a 30-second speech on a microphone. But being able to go online, map your area, submit that as testimony, I'm hopeful that that will be something that a lot of people will do. But media's gotten a lot better at covering this. I expect that will help with facilitating people's engagement. And as somebody else said earlier, once we do start seeing lines, I think it's going to be a lot of people waking up and realizing that they need to do something.
Well, and just to get back also to one of the points that Matt made earlier, I don't have the exact statistic in front of me, but the numbers of cities and school boards in particular that are now doing district elections as opposed to sort of general elections, it's skyrocketed exponentially. So what does that mean for redistricting? What does that mean for consultants? What does that mean just in terms of the work ahead?
Well, the CVRA, the California Voting Rights Act, has basically disallowed the use of at-large election systems anywhere that there's racially polarized voting. And in most places, at least places that have any kind of racial composition, they do have generally racially polarized voting. The bar has been set pretty low. So you do see, hundreds of agencies converting from at-large election systems to districts. Most recently, we did conversions for the city of Napa and the city of Davis to convert them to districts. And then in Santa Ana, they had districts, but they didn't elect just the person for their district. They had districts for where you had to come from, but the elections were at large. And they got sued by the Vietnamese community on the western side of the city, where there's really strong density, and created the first essentially Asian opportunity district in the city's history. So those conversions have been very powerful. When you talk to county registrars, city officials, a lot of these agencies, there is a lot of stress about how they're all going to do this redistricting in this coming period, especially with maybe the census data coming late, a very narrow window to get the process done. But yeah, there's going to be a ton more redistricting around the state than before. And with the rule changes, it's going to be much more significant. You're not going to have redistrictings that are just incumbent gerrymanders in California anymore. You're going to have redistrictings that really speak to the shape of the community, as opposed to, drawing little slithering lines out to every incumbent member's houses.
Do you think this could result in the primary being delayed?
I think that right now the commission and other actors in this have to decide when they're going to set their deadline. I don't think that the commission can set the deadline for, this February 15th, which might be one interpretation of the court's ruling, because it would make it really hard for us to even pull off a primary election in time. And the best lines in the world are useless if you can't have them implemented in a way that people know where they're running, can run for office, and actually have those implemented. So if they move the date for the completion to something, maybe the first week in January or something like that, then I think that they can continue to use the existing primary election date. And then we can, even decide after that set whether or not, a week or two difference in the primary election date makes sense.
And former Commissioner Dye, so if we're looking at the calendar, if the state gets the data at the end of September, Berkeley has to do whatever they have to do with the data. So you guys, the commission gets it at the end of October. Is it realistic to go from the end of October to, say, the first or second week of January to get everything done you guys would need to get done?
Well, this commission has far more time than we do to, to get all that community input. And to me, the issue is not so much when the final deadline is, because if you recall from our last process, our final deadline was August 15th. We got our final, we were required to display it in public for 14 days. We got our final maps, squeaked it out by August 1st. And then we displayed it for 14 days. And basically we couldn't do anything with the final input we got because there was no time. So what was actually really critical for us was the time between the draft maps and, and the time we took to interpret that and retweak the lines and all that to the final map. And so I think that's going to happen, in the December timeframe, no matter which end date you're going to end up with. And I've opined on that to advocacy groups that they're going to be stuck with that regardless, because that is the critical time. I think the commission has not formally made a decision of whether they're going to use the legacy format data, but based on the timeline that Karen mentioned in the first panel, theoretically they could end up with a fully constituted, prisoner adjusted data, that's reflective of the true census data about a week before the official census data comes out. So that basically buys them a couple weeks of time by using the legacy format data. I suspect the commission will probably vote to adopt that because, with the statewide database, we just have a very qualified group to manipulate census data that many other states are not as fortunate to have. I know the advocates are pushing for January 28th deadline, which I think they could still keep the primaries where they are, even with that January 28th deadline. It's been done before. And former Commissioner Anchetta actually sent a legal brief to the current commission stating that has been done before, where the primaries continued on. But honestly, all this fuss about when the primaries are, I think it's all a red herring. I think the average California, if you ask them when the primary was, they would not be able to tell you the date. Many of them wouldn't even be able to tell you the month. Right. So the testimony we've been hearing presented to the commission about, oh, you're going to disenfranchise all these Californians if you move the primary, I think it's complete BS.
Mm-hmm. No, that is a very good point. I mean, I think it's sometimes we political reporters and also, insiders in Sacramento, et cetera, we do get fixated on certain things that perhaps matter less to the general public.
It just doesn't matter to the average voter. I mean, most people don't pay attention to an election until maybe a month before it happens.
When your mailbox starts getting completely full
and that's when you find out when the primary is.
And actually, you brought up the prisoners, which is an important issue. But the other issue I wanted to bring up, which we didn't talk about earlier, the communities impacted by wildfires. How do you deal with that?
I think that's tough. I mean, I think you treat them as one of these communities you're going to have to do special outreach to. Eric Mcgee presented something in the first session about, where he thinks that people probably moved over from the wildfire. And I think that, there's probably some data on where people relocated to and to try to do some special outreach in those areas. But yeah, I mean, I think they're a group that's been, particularly impacted, and you're going to have to, basically take some special measures to do outreach to them.
And Professor Wang, I was being a little California centric here. Can you tell us about some of these similar issues that we're seeing across the country, anomalies, unique conditions that need to be taken into account for that are unique this year?
Well, everybody's got the similar problem of the final data release happening mid-August in an old format. Groups are probably going to convert that pretty quick to a useful format. And then final data release in September. So everyone's starting a little bit late on that. The kinds of things that are going to happen all around the country are almost certainly highly abbreviated timelines for redistricting, both because of time pressures having to do with the next year's elections. Also because honestly, in cases where it's single party control for legislation, legislators are probably going to do their best to limit the public comment period and just really abbreviate the input period. So in some ways, the structure of the California process is more orderly. We're probably going to see, for instance, I'll give you an example. There's in Wisconsin, there's a bitter partisan battle between the General Assembly and the governor brewing over redistricting. And the rumor has it that the Wisconsin legislature is very interested in really making sure that the drawing process is as rapid as possible and leaving as little time as possible for public input. A few states have elections this year in 2021, that ship has sailed at this point. New Jersey and Virginia were originally going to be under a lot of time pressure to get their maps drawn by this November. That's basically over now. Like that can's gotten kicked down the road. But yeah, I would say one thing that commissions have thought about doing, and I think some of them have started to do, Oklahoma, they started to do it, is to use population estimates to draw a draft map and then leave those up for public comment and then let the final census numbers come out. And I assume their intention is to adjust the lines to create compliance with the rule that legislative districts have to be within 10% of each other. So everybody's scrambling in different ways.
And we've seen a couple of lawsuits. I don't think any of them have been successful yet. But is there any legal vulnerability you see? And I think there's a proposed legislation in the House right now, which I think is designed to sort of give the census some protection and because of all these delays. Yeah,
so there's a live lawsuit right now. There are several live lawsuits. One is to force release of census data early to let commissions do their work and let legislators do their work. I think that's in Ohio. There's another in Alabama. It's kind of inside baseball, but and there's been a lot of concern expressed. I think maybe wrongly so. The census has statistical noise added to it to protect the privacy so that your individual information cannot be backed out from census responses. And that's enough to protect privacy, but not, in our calculations, not nearly enough to affect any kind of fairness metrics for redistricting. And we're pretty confident about that. But Alabama has filed a lawsuit to not allow that privacy protecting, it's called differential privacy, to not allow that differential privacy to be added into the data. And it's a bit of a mystery why they're demanding this, but they seem to be really intent on not allowing that privacy protection to be in the census. It's been a mystery to us in the redistricting community why they don't want that, because it doesn't seem to affect redistricting. It's a live issue among redistricting nerds, or dorks, as you would put it. And so, that's live. I'd call that kind of, for all the insiders on this call who obsess over all things redistricting, differential privacy is like this dorky thing we're all worried about over the next few weeks or so. And, glad to nerd out over that with any of you afterwards.
Mm-hmm. And we're getting some questions from the audience. I'd like to bring a couple of these in. One of the questions is, last cycle, did commissioners prioritize their own hometowns over others, even if it was perhaps unintended at the time? How did the former commission overcome their own personal biases or biases?
I think that's for me. So no, we absolutely did not prioritize our own hometowns. In fact, I remember, so I'm from San Francisco, and I remember being asked by a Bay Area reporter, shoving a microphone in my mouth. They said, oh, California used to have, San Francisco used to have 2 state senators. And I hear the commission's, only, drawing a map so that San Francisco will only have 1. What do you think about this? And I said, well, the population of San Francisco is about 800,000 people. And there are about, 900 and some odd thousand people that are supposed to be in each state Senate district. So how many state senators do you think San Francisco should have? It's like, we're using the data. So no, we did not prioritize our hometowns. Now, we did know more about our hometowns. And part of the reason that the diversity of the commission is so important is that between the 14 of us, we pretty much knew every corner of California. And so we had personal knowledge as well. And in addition to all the public input, we could also bring our own personal knowledge, in my case of the Bay Area, to bear on judging whether some of the testimony was accurate, or or if we could add some flavor or augment and validate some of the testimony. So we certainly were expected to bring our own lived experiences to the commission, but I did not see any evidence that anyone prioritized their hometowns.
Do you and your former commissioners still talk? Are you sort of?
Oh yeah.
Do you have a WhatsApp group where you're sort of?
We really bonded as a group, and yeah, I do feel a lot of compassion for the 2020 commission that they haven't had that that same experience. I mean, I think they're doing okay, and they're they did some of the stuff that I recommended to them, do these Zoom lunches, you can still simulate it to a large degree. It's not the same as meeting in person, but you can simulate, maybe 75% of it. But yeah, and we're trying to keep an eye on the current commission and be supportive to them in their efforts.
Okay, here's another audience question. Is there any chance this year that each Board of Equalization district can include 20 assembly districts and each state Senate district can include 2 assembly districts, so nesting? This person says, it'd be so nice to have ED1 cover ADs 1 through 20 and SD01 cover ADs 1 and 2, et cetera. Do you have any thoughts on this?
Yeah, so we did not do perfect nesting because, and I do not believe this commission will be able to do that either. And that's simply because it's the 6th and last criterion of our rank order criteria. And if you do perfect nesting, you will violate the higher order criteria. So if you read the final report where we justify each of our districts, you will see discussion of, that we did, 75% nesting in this case, or what have you. We just have to be really careful before the final maps and go back and revisit each of the criteria in order and make sure we were doing it in the correct rank order.
I understand why the commission did that. I have to tell you, though, that I would have bet my house that they would have nested districts when the whole thing started, and it just never quite worked out that way. Paul, you're shaking your head. Do you agree, disagree?
Well, I think that Commissioner Dye is right that the challenge was trying to meet other criteria, primarily Voting Rights Act. So imagine, I love doing redistricting with my hands, but imagine that this area is a county, and you have like a heavy Latino population here and a heavy Latino population here. You have 2 Voting Rights Act Latino majority minority districts. Now, are you going to create a Senate district that bridges those 2 together with some crazy thing? Or are you going to draw the districts in a way where you're diluting the Latino strength somewhere else? So you might have like 2 Latino assembly seats, and then you might have a way to make this like in a Senate district that's Latino majority minority as well, but not make them all perfectly nested. And so all those different criteria coming together just makes them not perfectly nested. And once you make one district not perfectly nested, then by definition, the next one's not perfectly nested. And it takes a while for you to get back to where you could perfectly nest a couple together.
And Matt, you might remember, in fact, our first draft maps, we did do perfect nesting because honestly, we ran out of time and we were trying to meet our June 15th deadline for getting the first draft maps out. And so we had done kind of the best we could. And then we're like, oh shit, we have to nest these things. So we're just like, okay, Karen, put those two together. And that's how we got our draft maps out. And we just got wailed on by the public. We had so many tomatoes thrown at us after the first draft maps, which all of you probably remember in great detail. And a lot of it was because we kind of whiffed on the nesting at the end. And so when we did the final maps, we realized we just couldn't do that. It just was not going to be that neat for precisely the reason that Paul explained.
And Seema, if we all wave, we can wave to another commissioner who's in the audience. So former Commissioner Angelo and Chet is in the audience watching. And it is one of those things that I never predicted, but there is this little group of former commissioners, and you'll see them popping up in local redistricting presentations. We've been fortunate to have Commissioner Dye participate in these. Even we have a panel coming up that we're doing where we have the independent commissioner from Arizona with commissioners from California doing panels. And it's like this work of having engaged in this redistricting has kind of changed who they are and how they identify themselves to the point where they see this as part of their mission to go continue to work in this space and to, continue to help other agencies as these commissions are proliferating.
We're super dorks.
And they're dorks, yeah.
But I love it. It's fantastic. And especially, as you said, we're seeing so many more of these commissions pop up across the country. So I feel like a lot of people are turning to California and some of the earlier states, to get some guidance. Paul, one of the things you brought up were minority communities when you were using your hand example. I said a question. So I'm a little obsessed with California losing a congressional seat and the potential of that coming out of LA County. If that happens, how do you preserve representation for minority communities? At the same time, you might have to pluck one of those seats out or draw. I'm not sure how to.
Are you saying losing a congressional district and how it's going to affect the minority communities?
Yeah, especially if it comes out of LA County.
Yeah, so I've been DMing with one of your other panelists after he said that he thought that the Democrats would be the ones that lose a congressional district. And I'll hit that, but first, when we talk about redistricting with hands, Google Patton Oswalt has this great little bit he does where he does redistricting on a podcast, and he's like trying to explain redistricting without being able to show maps. It's a very funny bit. But one of the issues is that there was this discussion that LA is an area where the state, we believe, based on census estimates, is growing at a rate slower than the rest of the state. So it makes sense that districts there would be growing and expanding out, and that you might have like an LA area. One of the speakers actually said it, I think, better, that you might have an LA area where you have like a fifth of a district kind of like moving out here, a third of a district moving out there. You have these cumulative effects, and that eliminates collectively a seat somewhere, but it's not really clear where it ever was. One of the issues is that if you were to think that the commission was just gonna, use their magic eraser and get rid of a district in order to get to 52, if that was the theory, I would argue that it wouldn't be a Voting Rights Act district. And so when you look at if they look at the members of Congress that aren't in Voting Rights Act districts, then it isn't 4-to-1 ratio of Democrat to Republican or 5-to-1 ratio of Democrat to Republican. It's more even. And so it's really unclear if we did find ourselves in a situation where one seat was removed, whether or not it would be Democrat or Republican, but I don't think it'll come at the expense of minority communities and their representation.
Anyone else have thoughts they want to add?
I was just going to make, if anything, I think is going to increase minority representation. It just won't be in LA County. It'll be where it's growing, right, in the Inland Empire area. So it'll spread out. I was like really interested to see Eric's presentation about the Asian community growing again. That all the growth is in these exurb kind of areas where people are commuting a bit more. So yeah, I don't think it'll be at the expense of minority communities. The other thing that I thought was interesting that Eric, was postulating that it would be a Democratic district that would be lost. And again, as Commissioner Sadwani said, the commissioners don't think about districts as Democratic districts or Republican districts. I mean, that's not what we think, right? We think about agricultural districts or urban districts or, again, characteristics that are representative of the people, because that is the way that we're drawing these districts. And how those districts end up leaning from a partisan basis is just how the chips fall. So I think it's going to be very hard to say.
I understand that you guys obviously aren't looking at partisan lines, but I mean, we do know, certain communities are more likely to be registered one way or the other. So, I mean, it does seem like there is, even if it's not intentional, that there is a partisan result.
That may be true, but elections actually are important. And the one thing that this commission did from 2011 was different than 2001. I think only really one district, really congressional district anyway, changed hands during that first decade. And during the second decade, we had several go back and forth. And so redistricting partially does determine some election outcomes, but you still have to have good candidates. You have to run good campaigns, and you have to be able to get through that stuff. So it is certainly indicative of who's likely to win, but it's not everything.
And you're certainly right. I mean, we saw that with the midterms in 2018 and then 2020. I mean, with so many districts, flip-flopping, and also the amount of attention that both parties are paying to several congressional districts in the upcoming midterms that they.
Yeah, and one point that I always make, because a number of the former commissioners have been involved in making these kinds of presentations to advocates and in all these in our nation's most gerrymandered states that are all fighting for independent redistricting reform, is that California, unlike Arizona, did not have competitiveness as one of its criterion. So of the 6 criterion, competitiveness is not one of them. And that's because competitiveness is usually defined as political competitiveness, which would have forced us to look at the partisan makeup. And that's kind of you know, the antithesis of California's process. And yet, at the end of it, California's maps were considered among the most competitive in the nation because we have these, you know, 7 districts that are flip-flopping because they are extraordinarily competitive. But that is just a result of the people who live in those areas and the districts that we drew around that. Again, we did not do that with any intent to make them partisanly competitive. It's just the way it worked out.
Paul, you brought up Patton Oswalt, and then obviously we've seen Arnold Schwarzenegger do a lot of stuff in this space. Does having celebrities involved in redistricting, does that help, you know, does that bring it into the public eye? Or more people paying attention now? Oh, I think you're muted.
Sorry. We should. I'm hoping that there will be like Saturday Night Live skit with Matt Rexroad characters, and I don't want to make redistricting sexy. I want to make a parody of redistricting nerds. It would be fun to have more attention paid to it. I think it is incredibly important, and we'll see what happens as we get through the process. We in California, we're unfortunately going to be in the shadow of a recall for a good part of it. What I'm expecting is that people are going to wake up after the recall election and be like, oh my God, they're drawing lines. And we'll start to see a lot of real intense engagement then.
So we can all take a vacation like sometime next year or the year after, I think.
Oh yeah, absolutely. 23, you can come stay with us in Mexico.
Professor Rank, actually, yeah, just in terms of the idea of people being involved in the process who aren't necessarily dorks or nerds, as we apparently like to call ourselves. You were talking about some of the various tools such as DirectR and Representable that are various ways that people can, you know, interact with this. Are they, one of our audience members asked, do they all have roughly the same tools in their toolkit, or do some provide additional levels of data or details that others don't? What can you tell us about these various tools?
Well, they all have the ability to draw a community of interest and then to have it be output as a digital map that's relatively convenient for a commission or a legislator to make use of. Then beyond that, they have different features. So for example, in Dave's redistricting, that tool is built into a functionality that lets you calculate partisanship and racial composition. If you look at representable.org, representable.org has the interesting features of allowing you to make a comment about what kind of community you have, like what its interests are. It has the ability to upload that to a shared database that's then publicly available. And in certain jurisdictions, Representable has made a direct deal with, say, a commission. I've actually forgotten where. I think Colorado. They're working on places like Dane County and New York State. But the idea is that then the input goes directly to the commission. So for instance, Corinne McDonald, so the We Draw the Lines tool, I think has that ability to go directly to the commission because it's a software product of the commission. So overall, I mean, look, I'm biased, of course, because representable.org was written by my students. And so I have to disclose that as a possible conflict of interest. But they've created a tool that was very much inspired by We Draw the Lines that allows that kind of input. If I may, I just want to interject something in response to a statement about whether a Democratic or Republican district will be eliminated. Because the California Commission is not allowed to to take account of partisanship, there is always the possibility of an accidental gerrymander being drawn. Through no action of theirs, you could imagine that just by chance, there might be a map that in some part or in whole doesn't really do such a great job of giving a fair shake to the political parties. And I'd say that broadly, this is unlikely because there are so many constraints that they have to take in, that they have a process that involves getting help from citizens and working with one another. It's unlikely, but a watchdog role that citizens can play, citizens are under no such obligation. Citizens can take into account whatever they want. And if they notice that a map is terribly unfair to one political party or the other, I'm fairly confident that the California Commission will hear about that from citizens, even if they themselves are not attending to it. So I think citizens have all kinds of roles to play, whether it be reporting communities of interest or just, you know, scoring a plan and saying, I don't know, Republicans got screwed there, or I don't know, Democrats got screwed there, or I don't know, you didn't draw any competitive districts. So I think that there's so many ways citizens can weigh in, but I just wanted to stick that in.
If I can dive in there a little bit, I think it's an interesting concept. to me, gerrymandering requires intent. You have partisan gerrymandering, racial gerrymandering, incumbent gerrymandering. If this current commission, without any competitiveness criteria, draws lines that respect communities of interest, that protect those minority populations, allowing them to have the ability to elect a candidate of choice, follows the geography of the state, and creates elections that aren't scored as being competitive or not, I don't think that that would be a failure of the commission. That would just be how California lays out. And without any competitiveness criteria, even if somebody did come to the commission, and Commissioner Dye, I'd love to hear what she thinks, but if somebody came to the commission and said, your plans are out of whack because they favor this party or the other party, and you were confident that you built the plans with the intention of empowering communities, would that kind of a claim sway you? Or would you say, well, people in California just live where they live then, and they vote for who they vote for?
I think you're exactly right. We've actually, been asked this question before, and our attitude has always been that let the chips fall where they may, right? We're going to draw the best maps that we can, following the rank order criteria, and and listening to the community input. And we're going to be completely transparent about how we make our decisions, and provided that written rationale for every district, and how it turns out in terms of, partisanship, that did not figure into our deliberation at all. And that's just how it turns out.
But I think that these tools can also be really powerful for going into other redistrictings where there is ill intent, whether it's a local redistricting, a county redistricting, a city redistricting, and being able to say, look, we ran the data. Like, you're not, as a local member of an organization or just somebody who lives in Glendale, you're probably not empowered to be able to do algorithms and regression analysis and all this stuff that's necessary to analyze and do ensembles and all these things that are fancy redistricting nerd things to prove that your city redistricting is a sham. But now with things like Representable and other tools that will come online, you will. So I do think that that's a powerful element that we're going to see in this redistricting. And I think I cut off Matt, which is one of my pastimes.
You're very good at that, Paul. But I was just going to add that, oftentimes in California, we get lost in our size. When people are bragging about the idea that we have 7 competitive districts with we have 53 congressional seats, that means 46 aren't, right? And so oftentimes that's, we're talking about 15% being possible switches, but that I tend to agree with Paul's overall statement in regards to redistricting. As long as the process is fair and takes all of those criteria into place, the results are the results. It just needs to be a fair process.
People live where they live.
Yeah, it's a fair process.
And whether they choose to identify as Republican or Democratic or no party preference, that's up to them.
And I think Matt's point about 15% of our districts are competitive is interesting, because there are states where that's one district. There are states when they, that would be the whole thing. So the
one district, and people complain about it.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
Like, it's only one.
Yeah, I think that they have the easiest job in redistricting, as opposed to California with its many challenges and many communities and geography and everything else. Let's go back to, sorry, Professor Wang, you mentioned conflicts of interest with your students, which of course you should have conflicts of interest, backing your students. But let's go back to talking about conflicts of interest potentially for the commission. Matt brought up some communications that I think some people have raised questions about. One of our audience members wants to ask about, in terms of other states, do other commissions have strict ex parte laws? I remember when I covered the California Coastal Commission, they'd start every meeting with like, I met with this person, I had breakfast with this person gave me a phone call, this person sent me a letter. In terms of the Redistricting Commission, what kind of disclosures are required? And it sounds like, Matt, it sounds like you don't think they're meeting them.
Well, actually, I'm not sure that I know what they're not doing. I have some suspicion because conversations are mentioned in the meeting that aren't disclosed in an ex parte communications way. One of their new legal counsels is also doing the redistricting down in Santa Barbara, where they're reporting the commissioners at every meeting, report their ex parte communications, whatever they have. And so that is a standard, but this is a question of openness and transparency, and they're going through this process. And I think this commission, once they get their staff determined and everything else, that may change, but it's usually pretty common when you have an entity that's more judicial in the way that they do things to report the communications that they end up having outside of their public hearings.
So,
I'm
yeah,
sorry.
I would make I mean, that's something that's actually been a great concern to former commissioners, and a few of us, including Commissioner Filkins-Weber, have made comments to that effect. We actually started the tradition of creating two-person, task force so that we would be exempt from Bagley-Keene, the Open Meetings Act that governs state agencies, because when it came down to the nitty-gritty of actually drawing lines in certain areas, it just became unwieldy that we would have to do a 14-person meeting and do a 14-day advance notice when we just needed to work some things out. But we were also very clear that these two-person task force were advisory only. No decisions were made. We always reported out in the general meetings, and decisions would be made as a group. What was concerning, and I believe is what Commissioner Jody Filkins-Weber had pointed out, is that I believe it was Commissioner Sadwani actually, mentioned in one of the last public meetings that they had a special session. She and I think it was Commissioner Toledo, who formed a task force with a bunch of community organizations that they had invited that was not open to the public, and that is of concern because that potentially is a breach of their responsibility to not discuss redistricting matters, outside of a public forum. But to be fair, they're in the middle of hiring new general counsel, so I'm going to give them the benefit of the doubt and imagine that was just an oversight on their part. And I would hope that they would be much more careful moving forward, that they don't have special meetings where only certain people are invited, because that starts to look like smoke-filled back rooms of yesteryear, and I'm sure that they do not want to be affiliated with that.
I'll be calling you for a quote next week. Thank you very much. And I mean, also in all seriousness, I mean, there isn't as much media in Sacramento as there once was. Is that harming? Do you feel like this is getting the coverage it should get?
I was actually surprised that no one else had called them out on that yet, but it may be that nobody else knew.
Mm-hmm.
Well, anybody who's watching this panel knows now.
That's right. I'll have to check the roster later to see if any of my competitors are on here so I can determine when I can write that story. So yeah, so I mean, it sounds like you guys had pretty strict rules back in the day in terms of what you disclosing everything real time.
Well, we were very just beyond the rules and beyond the law. I mean, the first commission was just extremely conscious of the weight of legacy on our shoulders. And we were very, very conscious of optics. And, I will say this, that, as annoying as trying to comply with Bagley-Keene and our rules about transparency, as annoying as it could be and inconvenient as it could be at times, I would say that it really saved our butts time and time again, that we did everything out in the open, that there was a public transcript and people could go back and look at videos and go refer to things. I believe that's why we won all of our lawsuit was unanimous decisions from the California Supreme Court. In fact, they commonly would reference what an open and transparent process we had. When there was, concern about some of the different decisions we made about Voting Rights Act districts, they could go back to the record and they could look and they could see the deliberation. When we had concern about these AstroTurf organizations, these fake organizations, and I'm going to mention this was brought up in the first panel about the ProPublica article, which is you know, the bane of our existence, that we are so highly annoyed that they think we're all bumbling idiots and that we were not aware that that was happening. But everybody, you know, all the commissioners were completely aware of, you know, fake testimony when it was happening. And when we weren't aware, you know, people would tell us. They would say, did you know so-and-so is on such and such a staff? And did you know they had a meeting before this meeting where they organized all these people? I mean, you know, because of our transparency, you know, basically everybody was called out. So, I mean, I think, you know, it's very unlikely that we missed anything where it was fake testimony, because somebody would call them out, even with email, you know, petitions. Someone would say, did you know this petition was organized by so-and-so? I mean, because all of it was posted on the website, people knew it was happening and somebody would call them out.
You bring up lawsuits. For the commission going forward, do they face any particular vulnerability because of whether it's a shortened time? I mean, there's always going to be lawsuits, right? But do they face greater vulnerability because of the compressed time period after they get the data, in terms of how much testimony they can take about proposed maps or anything like that?
There's always, there are always going to be lawsuits. I don't know that they're at greater or lesser risk than that. I know that, you know, during our term, we were actually threatened by some advocacy groups where they literally said, we will sue you if you don't do this. And in the end, they didn't sue us because, again, we had an open, transparent process, and everyone could tell that we bent over backwards to try to listen to everyone and try to incorporate the input, and they could see that input being incorporated in open session. So, you know, I think that that is the best legal defense.
Mm-hmm. Paul and Matt, what do you think? And also, Professor Wang, like, do you see this in other states as well?
Which part of it are we talking about here?
I'm sorry, the potential, is there any greater legal exposure because people are going to be moving really quickly, and the lack of, I mean, the public input after the data comes and after the proposed maps come out?
I mean, there's legal exposure at multiple stages of the process. And I will say that one advantage of the commission process is that it really reduces the odds of a challenge on the grounds that a community was not respected, or that there was say, for instance, in places that are open to the idea in Pennsylvania or Ohio, that the political parties were in some ways treated unfairly. So there's a lot of legal jeopardy in other states. The one problem with any kind of lawsuit is that it takes years to play out. And what that means is if a map is poorly drawn, it takes sometimes the better part of a decade to play that out. And a process in which, like California's, in which these things get hashed out in public to meet criteria through supermajority, really reduces the legal jeopardy. And broadly speaking, I think that it's a minefield for many other states.
I completely agree with the professor, and I would add that one of the problems with elections and election law remedies and census remedies is you're unlikely to repeat the event so you can do it again, right? I mean, they're not, people say, well, let's redo the census. Well, that's just not a realistic remedy to be able to do that. So that's unlikely to happen, and you're really unlikely to rerun the election to have that happen again. So we don't have a lot of normal legal remedies as you have in tort law or other things like that to try to do those sorts of things. And so oftentimes, if people aren't involved in basically the injunction process to stop something from happening, it's not going to change things. But the professor, I think the default is that if a commission does it and they have an open and transparent process, whether it be a commission at the state level or local level, they get the benefit of the doubt. And I think that's what an independent commission generally gets, the benefit of the doubt that you don't get if you're a legislator or a caucus of a legislature doing it where people can't see it. I don't know, Professor, you have any thoughts on that? But I think that's generally the default.
I agree with that.
Here's an interesting audience question that I hadn't heard before. There have been some rumblings of the Citizens Redistricting Commission combining outreach for public input with counties or cities like LA, thus naming your community of interest to your county. Do you think this would be useful or confusing?
I think part of the challenge with that, so just to give a little bit of background, in one of the clients that we have, we're working with the County of Napa. And the County of Napa, we're working there with, our client is the county, the city, the Community College District, the County Office of Education, all those agencies. And we are going to have one joint meeting with all those agencies where we're going to release the mapping tools that we've developed with all of them using District R, where they're going to be able to have a little bit of an opportunity to tell the public about the redistricting process. There will likely be some community input at that point. But remember when I was talking in my presentation about the 3 important things about community of interest testimony, that it needs to be a community that has some kind of characteristic, it needs to be geographically drawn, and it has to have a connection to the agency. Well, if I'm a member of the public, my needs from the city might be specifically part of one community, and my needs from the county might be another. If I love dog parks and the county runs the dog parks, then the dog park community is maybe my most important community for that. If I am a parent and it's a school district redistricting or the County Office of Ed, then the needs of children in my area for access to different programs, educational attainment, good schools, all of those things are a different community of interest. We've done redistricting where, I kid you not, we had to map things like the almond growers and the walnut growers for a water district redistricting, or even elevation. I don't know if Commissioner Dye, if somebody had come to you and said, my house is 123 feet higher than this other person's house, I want to be in another district, the commissioners probably would have just rolled their eyes. But in a water district redistricting, it meant that they paid a different rate for water, or they had different issues. So the challenge with this idea of combined redistricting is for the county and the state, the communities of interest might be different because, and Commissioner Dye mentioned also, like with congressional redistricting, maybe they're looking at federal issues. Maybe in local redistricting and county redistricting, they're looking at unincorporated versus incorporated areas. So it's a little bit mixed. I think that doing outreach and pushing what is happening and mapping tools and opportunities as a combined effort is great. I think getting community of interest testimony could be confusing.
I completely agree. One of the other things is that, as Paul mentioned, it assumes that the county is a community of interest. And we found in many cases, remember, criterion number 4 puts counties, cities, neighborhoods, and communities of interest at the same level. And so we had to decide, in many cases, because those were often conflicting, as you might imagine, where do we observe the county lines and where do we observe the city lines, and where does, a community which may span those, where is that more important? And in some cases, we got testimony. For example, there's an area in California called the Four Corners area, where they provided testimony saying, "Hey, we are a community, and we're around, we're over four different counties, and that's because these county lines were drawn in the 1800s, and it's not relevant to who we are or how we live, and we are a distinct community." And then if you look at some city boundary lines, you'll discover they're really weird. And in many cases, they're not even contiguous. A really obvious example is the city and county of San Francisco includes SFO, which is not actually in San Francisco proper. But if you look at the city boundaries, county boundaries, it includes SFO. And do you want us to snake down there and include that? So, and that's true for a lot of cities. If you look at the city boundaries, it'll include their garbage dump, which is, in a totally different area. And do you really need to include it? I mean, there are no people living at the garbage dump, right? So, back to drawing districts based on where people are and what their concerns are and what their relevant concerns are. So I think that that's the kind of complexity once you start really getting into drawing the lines that you discover.
This reminds me of a time when I was doing a story about a city council race that involved the representative for San Pedro. So I went to San Pedro to go interview voters. I cannot tell you how many people I ran into were like, "We don't live in LA." I'm like, yes, you do. It's interesting. I mean, it's hard to see. I mean, just with LA alone, how do you have a community of interest when there's so many different communities?
Oh, well, try getting people to define their neighborhood. Right. So one thing we discovered, because neighborhoods is one of the political geographies we're supposed to adhere to, and we discovered there are no official neighborhood maps. I think with the exception of, I think San Diego was the only place that had official, city sanctioned neighborhood maps. I mean, most people would bring real estate maps, to justify that this is their neighborhood. And, real estate agents are always creating new neighborhoods, right? I mean, so it's like, are you going to draw districts based on that? It was kind of fuzzy, right?
Yeah, we did this because of this very issue. The LA Times did this neighborhood matching project in the city of LA, and we've used it for many different things, whether to to classify crimes or just all kinds of stuff. It's a pretty interesting database. So you guys should all check it out. So I'm sorry.
We used it for redistricting.
Excellent.
In the LA Unified School District redistricting, we used the LA Times mapping project maps. We got the shape file and actually utilized it to help define the neighborhoods.
Fantastic.
But there's competing. There were those neighborhoods, and then there were neighborhood. There's a governance structure in LA around neighborhood councils, and then there's things like police beat neighborhoods and those realtor neighborhoods. Like you can get Zillow data that shows their neighborhood. So it is kind of one of the projects we do when we do a local municipal redistricting, because we have to follow neighborhoods under Fair Maps Act, is we do a project with the GIS department to say, okay, for the purposes of redistricting, this is going to be our neighborhoods. And so when I say this plan splits 4 neighborhoods and that plan splits 8, we're at least speaking the same language. And it's this process that can be very political.
Yes, actually, I didn't even think about that. And now I'm thinking about my own city redistricting. So it'll be, I have to examine it more closely. This is
What city are you in?
I live in Long Beach.
Well, I'm working the Long Beach redistricting.
I thought you were like, do you have a conflict here? Can I interview you on this? But
yeah,
no, it's an interesting. I'm obsessed with Long Beach. I'm way too much of a Long Beach showbird. I should stop babbling about Long Beach because I could go on for an hour. But the communities are interesting in terms of how they've been split up in history. Like my former community there is split between 2 council districts in a way that, like, now thinking about it, I'm like, that makes no sense. Like the person who lives across the street from me is literally in a different council district. But anyway, I digress. Maybe we'll see a story about Long Beach redistricting as well. Who knows? So we're running out of time very quickly. So do you guys have 30 seconds of closing thoughts each? No.
You have to
My
pick
only
one
thought
of us
would
to
be
go first.
if the commission really wants people to turn out, throw out a map. That's what gets people to turn out is lines on paper. That's what changes everything. And so when I hear people say the thing we want the most is lots of community testimony, put a map out and you'll get it.
Well, they legally can't put it out until they have the census data from the prisoner population database. So
I get it.
But they can work to put something out, as soon as possible. So, I think if they really front load the process, which I believe they're trying to do, that as soon as the census data comes out, they should be able to overlay that data and do something really quick.
yeah, I mean, I was thinking about that, Commissioner Dye, when you were speaking earlier. Can you imagine how much easier it would have been for you to create those first draft plans if you had 5 months worth of community of interest testimony to use as the building blocks instead of kind of doing it from scratch?
Oh my God. The problem with the first commissions, we had to do everything in parallel. So, yes, it would have been fabulous. And I made this comment to one of the current commissioners that, drawing the lines once you have all that data is relatively easy. You're still gonna have to make those hard trade-offs, but actually drawing the lines, will not be that difficult. It should be relatively fast if you have all that data. So I'm actually pretty confident they can do it quickly if they, do a good job of trying to really capture all this community of interest data early on.
And Professor Rank, just to sum it up, how does what is going on in California impact the rest of the nation, and does this give you hope for some of the other places in terms of reducing gerrymandering?
For state legislative redistricting, I think California stands as an excellent example. Only about half of the states in the U.S. allow citizen initiatives, and it's really under that circumstance that it's easiest to form a mechanism like one has in California. An example where a state could do that in the future is Arkansas, which would be wonderful. Maybe even Mississippi. So I think that it's really excellent to have this transparency. We are super pleased at Princeton to be hosting some of the files of the former commissioners that Commissioner Dye provided to us. And so we're super happy to have that as a repository. So at gerrymander.princeton.edu, we're keeping that kind of information around in the Princeton University system. And I do think that as our nation goes through some difficulties with democracy in the next 5 to 10 years, I think it's really important to have these success stories. And although, to be frank, it's a tough time politically in the United States, I think having these kinds of examples can provide hope for the future. And I think in the coming decade or two, the efforts of local reformers and so on can really set an example for all of us in California, Arizona, Michigan, all around the country. So my hat's off.
And let's end it there. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Congratulations to the panel. Thank you all for participating. Thank you very much to the Jack Citrin Center for Public Opinion Research. I'm David Carrillo. I was your host today for the California Constitution Center. I want to thank everyone who participated. I hope the attendees enjoyed our presentation. Thank you for posing those very thoughtful questions. I'm sorry we didn't have to go to all of them. Thank you, everyone. We will end the recording now. Everyone have a good day.
Happy Friday.
Thank you.
Take care.